The sword came down 3 inches from his face. Leo did not flinch. He had trained himself out of flinching, the way other men trained themselves out of drinking. Slowly, painfully, and with the constant suspicion that it would come back the moment he stopped paying attention. His father, King Harold of Aldara, lowered the ceremonial blade and set it across the marble table between them. The throne room was empty. Just the two of them, and 40 generations of royal portraits staring down from gilded frames, with expressions that ranged from disapproval to something worse than disapproval. Boredom. 14 women, Harold said. Leo said nothing. 14 daughters from 14 noble houses, each one vetted, each one willing, each one sent home. They were willing to marry a crown, Leo said, not a man. Harold pressed both palms flat against the table. His knuckles were swollen. They had been swollen for 3 years now, ever since the illness began eating through him from the inside, turning the strongest king Aldara had seen in a century into a man who needed help climbing stairs. He was 56 years old and looked 80. "You think I married for love?" Harold asked. "No," Leo said, and it showed. The silence that followed could have shattered glass. Harold's marriage to Queen Catherine had been a masterwork of political engineering and personal ruin. Two people who shared a castle, a kingdom, a bloodline of heirs, and absolutely nothing else. Catherine had died 4 years ago, from a fever that took her in 3 days. Harold had stood at her funeral with the expression of a man watching a stranger's house burn. Not cold, not cruel, just unfamiliar with the geography of his own grief. Leo had been 21 then, he was 25 now, and every rejected bride was a sentence in the argument he could never quite say out loud. "I will not become you. You have until the Harvest Throne ceremony," Harold said. 4 months, choose a bride, or the succession passes to Victor. The name landed in the room like a dead animal. Victor, Leo's younger brother by 3 years, a man who smiled the way a trap smiles, all welcome and hidden teeth. Victor collected loyalty the way a spider collected flies, through patience and the slow construction of webs, so fine you did not see them until you were already caught. "You would hand the kingdom to Victor," Leo said, not a question. "I would hand the kingdom to someone willing to secure it. If that is not you, then it is him. Blood does not override duty. Not in this house." Leo looked at the portraits on the wall. His grandfather, his great-grandfather, men who had married strategically and ruled effectively and died in beds surrounded by heirs who did not weep because the relationship had never required it. A machine. That is what the monarchy was. A machine that ran on bloodlines and alliances and the careful bartering of human beings dressed in silk. He left the throne room without bowing. A small rebellion. One Harold noticed and did not punish, which told Leo everything about how tired his father truly was. In his own chambers, Leo stripped the rings from his fingers, 3 of them, one for his house, one for his station, one for his late mother, who had given it to him on his 16th birthday with the words, "This is the only thing in this palace that is yours, and not the kingdom's." He set them on the dresser and stood at the window, and watched the palace grounds spread out below him like a painting of a life that belonged to someone else. He called for Philip. General Philip arrived within the hour. A man built like a wardrobe that had been taught to fight, 60 years old, with a face carved from oak and a voice that could command a battlefield or calm a child with equal authority. He had been Harold's closest military advisor for 30 years, and Leo's secret confidant for 10. The kind of man who would follow you into a burning building and then critique your evacuation strategy on the way out. "Close the door," Leo said. Philip closed the door. "I need a new identity, a complete one. Name, background, service record." A border guard transferred to the capital. Someone so unremarkable that no one in this palace would look at him twice. Philip stared at him for a long time. Then he sat down, which was something Philip almost never did in the presence of royalty. "Explain," Philip said. Leo explained. The plan was simple, in the way that things are simple before reality gets hold of them. He would enter the palace guard as a common soldier, a nobody. He would live in the barracks, eat the food, stand the shifts. He would move through the palace, not as a prince but as a man, and in that space, stripped of title and wealth and the gravitational pull of power, he would find out if anyone could love the thing underneath the crown, or if there was nothing underneath the crown at all. Philip listened to the entire plan without interrupting. When Leo finished, the general folded his hands and said, "This is the most reckless idea you have ever had, and I am including the time you challenged the ambassador from Greymarch to a horse race while intoxicated. I won that race. You won that race because the ambassador's horse had better sense than both of you and stopped before the cliff. The horse made the right decision. You did not." Leo almost smiled. Almost. "Can you build the cover?" he asked. Philip could, and they both knew he would, because Philip understood something that Harold had never grasped. Leo was not refusing the crown. He was trying to find a reason to wear it that did not involve becoming his father. The cover took 2 weeks to build, a border outpost in the eastern mountains, Thornfeld, remote enough that no one in the capital would know its soldiers by sight. A commanding officer named Captain Marsh, who owed Philip a debt large enough to buy silence. A service record so thoroughly mundane that reading it would put you to sleep. 3 years of border patrol. No commendations, no incidents. A perfectly forgettable soldier named Emre Cole. Leo memorized the details like scripture. Emre Cole, born in Heathmore. Father was a tanner. Mother died young. Joined the guard at 18, because the leather trade was dying, and a uniform came with meals. Transferred to the capital because Thornfeld was being downsized. The man he was building was ordinary in every direction, and that was the point. On the night before he became Emre, Leo stood in his chambers and looked at himself in the mirror. 25 years old, tall, dark hair that had been cut and styled by a palace barber every 2 weeks since he was 12. Hands that had never done a day of labor that was not carefully supervised. He took the barber's shears from the drawer and cut his own hair. Badly, unevenly, the kind of haircut a man gives himself in a room without good light because he cannot afford to pay someone else to do it. He nicked his ear and watched a thin line of blood run down his neck and thought, good. Emre Cole would have a scar like that, a small one, the kind nobody asks about. He packed nothing. Emre Cole would not arrive with luggage. He would arrive with what he was wearing and whatever fit in a standard-issue guard's pack. Philip met him at the service entrance at 3 in the morning. The general handed him a worn leather pack, a guard's uniform 2 sizes too large, and a folded paper with a single line of text. The assignment posting. Eastern Servants' Corridor. Night watch. The worst posting in the palace, Philip said. Good. You will be sharing a barracks room with 5 other men. I cannot tell you what they will be like because I do not know. That is the point. You will be exposed. Truly exposed. For the first time in your life, no one will be screening the people around you. Leo took the pack. 4 months, Philip said. That is what your father gave you. I can protect your cover for perhaps 3. After that, the gaps will start showing. Questions will be asked. Victor is not stupid. Victor is brilliant, Leo said. That is the problem. He walked out the service entrance and into the dark. Behind him, the palace rose like a mountain of light and stone. Ahead of him, the barracks squatted at the edge of the grounds like an afterthought. A low, ugly building made of gray brick and practical ambition. He pushed through the door and into a hallway that smelled like boot polish and old soup. A duty officer sat behind a desk that was missing one leg, propped up with a stack of water-damaged books. The officer looked at Leo's transfer paper, looked at Leo, and grunted. Emre Cole? Yes, sir. Room 6. Down the hall, last door. Your bunkmates are already asleep. Do not wake them up, or they will make your first week something you will not enjoy. Leo walked down the hallway. The floor was uneven. The walls were stained with something he chose not to identify. The door to room 6 was open, and inside, 5 men lay on 5 narrow cots arranged so close together that turning over in the night meant pressing your face into another man's shoulder. The 6th cot was in the corner, nearest the window. The window did not close properly, and a draft cut through the gap like a blade. Leo set his pack on the cot and sat down. The mattress was thin enough to feel every slat of the frame beneath it. He lay back and stared at the ceiling. No one had called him, Your Highness, in 4 hours. No one had bowed. No one had adjusted their behavior, their tone, their posture, to accommodate his presence. He was lying in a room full of strangers who would treat him exactly the way they treated each other, which was to say, without gentleness, without deference, and without the slightest interest in his comfort. He had wanted this. He kept reminding himself of that. Morning arrived like a fist. A bell rang somewhere in the building at an hour Leo's body associated with deep sleep, and his new life associated with duty. The 5 men in his room rose like the dead climbing out of graves, groaning, swearing, moving with the mechanical precision of people who hated what they were doing, but had done it so many times that hatred no longer slowed them down. The man in the cot nearest to Leo was named Simon, broad, bald, a face that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts by someone who was in a hurry. He looked at Leo and said, "New one? Transferred from Thornfeld." Simon snorted. "Thornfeld? What did you do wrong?" "Nothing." "Nobody gets transferred to the capital from Thornfeld for nothing. You either made someone angry or made someone uncomfortable. Which was it?" Leo hesitated one beat too long. "Made someone uncomfortable," Simon decided for him. "Good. That means you have a spine. Keep it to yourself and we will get along." The other men introduced themselves in the shorthand of people who did not have time for full sentences. Nate, Owen, Peter, Daniel. Names and handshakes, and then everyone was pulling on uniforms and moving toward the door. Breakfast was served in a hall that made the barracks look luxurious. Long wooden tables, benches worn smooth by generations of soldiers who had sat in the same spots and eaten the same food, and complained about it in the same words. The food was porridge, gray, thick, served by a woman who wielded the ladle with the energy of someone who had given up on the concept of enjoyment and was now simply fulfilling a contract with the universe. Leo ate it, all of it, not because it was good, but because Emre Cole would not waste food. Emre Cole had grown up in a house where meals were not guaranteed, and you cleaned your plate because the alternative was a memory your stomach carried longer than your mind. Captain George found him after breakfast. Captain George was the head of the palace guard, a man who had been hardened by 30 years of service into something that resembled a human being the way a cliff resembles a gentle slope. Same general shape, completely different experience to encounter. He was short, thick, and had the kind of voice that did not need to be raised because its natural volume was already a command. "Cole." "Yes, sir." "You are on night watch. Eastern Servants' Corridor. Shift begins at sundown, ends at sunrise. You stand. You watch. You do not sit. You do not sleep. You do not speak to the staff, unless they speak to you first. And even then, you keep it short. This is not a social posting. This is a job. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir." "Good. Also, your hair is a disgrace. Fix it." Leo almost laughed. Almost. The Eastern Servants' Corridor was exactly what its name promised. A long, dim hallway that connected the palace kitchens, to the laundry, to the records hall, to the servants' quarters. The artery through which the palace's invisible workforce moved. Cooks, cleaners, clerks, laundresses. People who kept the kingdom running, while the kingdom pretended they did not exist. Leo stood at his post and watched them pass. A river of people who did not look at him. Not because he was beneath their notice, but because a guard standing in a corridor was as interesting as a wall sconce. Part of the architecture. Functional. Ignorable. The first night was long, in a way that redefined the word. 12 hours of standing. His legs began to ache after 4. His back after 6. By hour 8, he was shifting his weight from foot to foot in a rhythm that became the only entertainment available. By hour 10, he was composing speeches in his head. Speeches he would give as king, about labor conditions, about the men and women who worked 12-hour shifts in corridors no one important ever walked through, while earning wages that would not cover the cost of a single bottle of wine from the royal cellar. By hour 12, he was not composing speeches. He was just trying not to fall down. Simon found him in the barracks after his shift and said, "First night?" Leo nodded. "Gets easier. Your legs will stop screaming after a week. Your back will take 2. Your pride never recovers, but that is actually the useful part." Leo lay on his cot and stared at the ceiling and thought about his bed in the royal chambers. Silk sheets, feather pillows, a mattress so thick you sank into it like a stone into warm water. He had wanted this. He kept reminding himself. The days blurred. Captain George assigned him every undesirable task available, which in the palace guard was a deep and creative catalogue of misery. Standing post outside the laundry in summer heat until his uniform turned white with salt. Carrying supply crates from the delivery gate to the storage rooms, which were always located at the top of the most stairs the architect could fit into the building. Cleaning the barracks latrine, a task that required the kind of mental fortitude usually reserved for battlefield medicine. Leo did all of it, without complaint, without the tight jaw and narrow eyes that would have signaled to a man like Captain George that here was someone who believed himself above the work. Emre Cole would not believe himself above the work. Emre Cole had grown up cleaning leather hides in a tanner's workshop and knew that dignity was not something a job could take from you unless you stored it in the wrong place. But Leo was not Emre Cole, and the performance was harder than he had expected. Not the physical work. That was painful but manageable. The hard part was the smallness of it, the complete and total absence of consequence. In his real life, every word he spoke was weighed by someone. Every gesture was interpreted. Every decision rippled outward through a court that tracked royal behavior the way astronomers track stars. Here, nothing he did mattered to anyone, beyond the 10-foot radius of his own body. It was the most terrifying freedom he had ever experienced. 2 weeks in, he nearly broke the cover. A senior guard named Barrett shoved him in the hallway for walking too slowly while carrying a stack of supply logs. Shoved him hard. Leo's back hit the wall, and the logs scattered across the floor, and his right hand went to his hip, where a royal sword used to hang. The motion was instinctive. Muscle memory built from 15 years of combat training that his body had not forgotten, even though his circumstances had changed entirely. Barrett saw the reach, saw the empty hip, laughed. "Looking for something, Cole? You planning to fight me with a supply log?" Leo picked up the logs, said nothing, walked away. His hand was shaking, and he squeezed the logs until the shaking stopped. The second near break was worse. He was standing post outside the kitchens when 2 workers came out the back door, smoking pipes and talking about the royal family. One of them, a heavy-set man with flour on his arms, said that Prince Leo had not been seen in public for 2 weeks, and the court was whispering that he had fled the country. "Always knew he was soft," the man said. "Born with a gold spoon in his mouth, and still could not handle the pressure. Probably off somewhere living the good life, while his father rots from the inside." The second worker, thinner, older, with the careful eyes of someone who had learned that walls had ears, said, "I heard he is simple, in the head. That is why they kept him away from the public. The brother is the real one, Victor. He is the one who will be king." Leo stood on the other side of the wall, with his fists balled so tight his nails cut crescents into his palms. Every muscle in his body was locked. His jaw ached from the pressure of keeping it shut. This is what they think of you. No, this is what they think of a man they have never met. A title they have projected a story onto, because the truth was never available to them. He exhaled, slowly, let the fists unclench, let the crescents in his palms sting and fade. This was the lesson, not the physical labor, not the bad food or the broken cot, or the 12-hour shifts that turned his legs to wood. The lesson was this: without the crown, he was nothing to these people. Not hated, not loved, nothing. A blank space where a person should be. And the question that followed him back to the barracks that night, the one that lay next to him on the thin mattress and breathed into his ear as he tried to sleep, was the one he had come here to answer. Was there anything underneath the crown worth loving? Or had the crown been doing all the work, and without it, he was just a man with a bad haircut, standing in a hallway, waiting for someone to tell him he mattered? He did not sleep that night. He lay in the dark and listened to 5 men snore and breathe and shift in their cots, and he thought about his father's words. Choose a bride, or the succession passes to Victor. 4 months. The clock was already bleeding, and he had not yet figured out how to make a single person in this palace look at him. The rotation changed on his 3rd week. Captain George posted the new assignments on the barracks wall at dawn, and Leo scanned the list with the same low-grade dread that had become his morning companion, expecting another stretch outside the laundry or the delivery gate, or whatever corner of the palace the captain had decided was the most effective place to test whether a man's spirit could be folded small enough to fit inside a uniform. Eastern Corridor, Records Hall, night shift. He had never been inside the Records Hall. In his real life, the Records Hall was a name on a building plan, a square on a map labeled Archives, that existed in the same mental category as the drainage system or the servant's pantry. Necessary. Invisible. Not his problem. In his new life, it became the only door he stood beside. The records hall was a large, low-ceilinged room at the end of the eastern corridor, behind a door that looked like it had been kicked more times than it had been opened politely. Inside, rows of wooden shelving stretched from floor to ceiling, packed with leather-bound volumes, rolled parchments, and stacked folios so dense with paper that the shelves bowed under the weight like tired shoulders. The air tasted like dust and forgotten ink, the kind of place where information went to age, and nobody visited unless they were being punished or were strange enough to enjoy it. 5 people worked in the records hall. 4 of them were elderly archivists who moved through the stacks like slow fish through deep water, silent and purposeful and completely uninterested in anything that happened outside their shelves. The 5th was not elderly, the 5th was not slow, and the 5th was the reason Leo would later look back on his 3rd week in disguise and realize that the entire plan had gone off course without him noticing. Her name was Clara. Leo did not learn her name for 4 days, because Clara did not speak to guards. She walked past him at the start of her shift and the end of her shift, and every moment between those 2 points, with the focused indifference of someone who had decided that the man standing beside the door was a piece of furniture. Not hostile, not warm, simply not relevant to her internal accounting of the world. She was 24, she was not tall, she had brown hair that she pinned up in a way that suggested she did it in the dark, by feel, without a mirror, and did not care whether it held. She wore the plain gray dress of a palace clerk, and she carried herself with the posture of someone who had been underestimated so many times that she had stopped correcting people and started using their low expectations as cover. Not because she was beautiful, although he would realize later that she was, in the way that a well-built bridge is beautiful. Functional, precise, designed not to impress but to hold weight. He watched her because she was the only person in the palace who moved through space, as though the space owed her something, and she was collecting. On his first night outside the records hall, she passed him without a glance. On his second night, she passed him without a glance. On his third night, she passed him without a glance, but he caught the edge of something, a slight adjustment in her trajectory. She had moved 2 inches further from him than necessary. Not away from him, around him. The way you walk around a puddle you have identified and categorized and decided is not worth stepping in. By the 4th night, Leo was fascinated, and frustrated, and aware that both of those feelings were deeply ridiculous, because he was a crown prince in a borrowed uniform being ignored by a filing clerk, and the fact that it bothered him said more about his ego than he wanted to examine. He learned her name from Simon, who knew everyone in the palace the way a river knows its banks, through constant, unavoidable contact. Clara Whitmore, Simon said, when Leo asked about the records hall staff. They were eating dinner in the guards hall, the same gray porridge that had apparently been the official meal of the palace guard since the founding of the kingdom. Clerk's daughter. Father died when she was young. She tested into the archives position. Top marks from what I hear. She does not talk to guards. I noticed. Simon gave him a look that was half amusement and half warning. She does not talk to guards for a reason. A guard named Derek ran a game on her last year, pretended to court her, took her on walks, brought her things from the market. Then he told the entire kitchen hall she was practice for a real woman. His words. She heard about it from a laundress who thought she was being kind by letting her know. Leo set his spoon down. She cried once, Simon continued. In the records hall, one of the archivists found her between the tax rolls for the western provinces. After that, she built the wall. No guards. No exceptions. Do not take it personally. Leo picked up his spoon. He did not take it personally. He took it structurally. A woman had been humiliated by a man in uniform, and she had responded by removing all men in uniform from her field of relevance. It was not spite. It was engineering. He respected it. He also, against every rational instinct in his body, wanted to get past it. Not for the plan. The plan was to find a wife, and Leo was self-aware enough to know that targeting a specific woman who had been hurt by a guard while he was pretending to be a guard was the kind of scheme that deserved to fail. He wanted past the wall because the wall was interesting, because the woman behind it was interesting, because in a palace full of people who either bowed to power or ignored the powerless, Clara Whitmore had built a category system that had nothing to do with rank and everything to do with personal experience, and Leo had never met anyone who operated on a framework that specific. So he did nothing. He stood outside the records hall and did his job, and did not speak to her, and did not try to speak to her, and waited. 3 more days passed. On the 7th day, she paused at the door on her way in, not to look at him, to adjust the strap on her satchel, which was overstuffed with papers she was bringing from somewhere else in the palace. The strap slipped, and 2 folios hit the ground, and papers fanned across the stone floor in a spread that looked like a card trick gone wrong. Leo did not move. He wanted to. His hands twitched. Every instinct built by 25 years of being raised to act, to lead, to solve, screamed at him to bend down and pick up the papers. But he remembered Simon's words. He remembered the wall. He understood that helping her in this moment, uninvited, would be an invasion dressed as courtesy, and she would recognize it instantly, because she had been trained by experience to recognize exactly that. Clara picked up the papers herself, reorganized them, stood, walked inside. But she paused at the doorframe. 1 beat, less than a second, and in that pause, Leo saw something he had not expected. Surprise. Not at the dropped papers, at the guard who had not moved, the guard who had watched her struggle and chosen not to help, and in doing so, had communicated something that helping never could have. I see your boundary. I am not going to cross it. It was the smallest possible moment, a fraction of a second in a doorway that smelled like dust and old leather. But Leo felt it land, a crack in the wall so thin it was almost imaginary. He went back to the barracks that night and lay on his cot and replayed that fraction of a second until Simon told him to stop smiling in the dark, because it was unsettling. The days on the Eastern Corridor developed a rhythm. Leo learned the pulse of the palace's invisible workforce. The kitchen staff arrived before dawn and worked through the morning in a haze of steam and shouted orders. The laundresses came next, hauling baskets of linens so heavy they walked at angles. The clerks arrived mid-morning, quiet and purposeful, carrying the weight of the kingdom's paperwork on their backs without complaint. And Clara arrived precisely at the same time every morning. She left precisely at the same time every evening. She worked in the records hall with an intensity that Leo could feel through the door. Some nights, he heard her talking to the older archivists. Not chatter, questions, specific, pointed questions about land deeds and judicial transcripts and tax records that suggested she was not merely filing documents, but reading them, understanding them, building something in her mind from the raw material of the kingdom's bureaucratic history. He began paying attention to what she carried. The folios she brought in were different from the ones she took out. She was cross-referencing, pulling records from different decades, different departments, and laying them side by side. For what purpose, he did not know. But the methodology fascinated him, because it was the methodology of someone who believed that information had weight, that the right document, properly understood, could change the trajectory of a decision, that the people who filed the papers had as much power as the people who signed them, if they were paying attention. Leo had never thought about paper this way. In his life, papers were things that arrived on his desk already interpreted, already summarized, already filtered through layers of advisors who decided what was important and what was not. The raw material of governance had never been available to him. It had always been cooked. He wondered what the kingdom looked like raw. On the 10th day of his records hall posting, something changed. Not between him and Clara, between him and the palace. He overheard a conversation between 2 senior guards outside the officers' quarters. They were discussing the staffing budget for the Eastern Corridor, and one of them mentioned, casually, that the records hall had been requesting a dedicated guard for 2 years, and the request had been denied every time, because the records hall was not considered a priority. Archives, the guard said, with the tone of a man who did not read. Who is going to break into the archives? Someone desperate for a tax receipt from 1402? The other guard laughed. Leo did not laugh. Because he understood, with the clarity that comes from standing in a hallway for 10 consecutive nights, that the records hall was unguarded, not because it was unimportant, but because the people who decided what mattered had never set foot inside it. The records hall contained the written memory of the kingdom. Every land deed, Every judicial ruling, every tax record, every census, the raw, unfiltered documentation of who owned what, who had been convicted of what, and who had paid what to whom. And nobody was watching it, because nobody important had ever been forced to walk past it. Until now. He filed this thought away. Not as Emre Cole, as Leo, as the man who might one day sit on a throne and decide what mattered. On the 12th day, Clara spoke to him. Not a greeting, not a pleasantry. She walked out of the records hall at the end of her shift, stopped 3 feet from his post, and said, "The left hinge on this door is rusting. It catches when I open it in the morning. Can you report it to maintenance, or is that outside your responsibilities?" Her voice was clear, direct, and stripped of warmth. A business transaction. She needed something done. He was the nearest functional authority. She was not inviting conversation. She was filing a request. "I will report it," Leo said. "Thank you." She walked away. Leo stood at his post and felt something absurd and specific happening inside his chest. A door hinge. She had spoken to him about a door hinge. And the warmth that spread through him was so out of proportion to the event that he would have been embarrassed if anyone could have seen it. He reported the hinge. It was fixed the next day. Clara noticed. She did not acknowledge it, but the trajectory of her path past his post shifted. 2 inches closer, back to the normal distance. The adjustment she had been making, the 2-inch detour around the puddle she had decided he was, disappeared. He was no longer a puddle. He was furniture again, but promoted furniture, the kind you do not walk around. The progress was glacial, and Leo, who had spent his entire life in environments where things moved at the speed of royal decree, found himself learning a kind of patience he had never needed, the patience of someone who cannot demand attention, who cannot summon interest, who must simply exist, consistently, in the same space, and wait for another person to decide, on their own terms, that he was worth acknowledging. It was the hardest thing he had ever done, harder than the shifts, harder than the food, harder than the latrine, because it required him to accept that his presence was not inherently valuable, that simply being there was not enough, that the thing he had to offer, if he had anything to offer at all, had to be demonstrated through behavior so consistent and so patient that it could not be mistaken for a game. Derek had played a game. Leo would not. On the 14th day, he arrived at his post and found a cup of tea sitting on the stone ledge beside the door. It was still warm. Steam curled from the surface in a thin ribbon that dissolved into the corridor's cold air. He looked at the cup. He looked at the closed door of the records hall. He looked at the cup again. No one else used this corridor at this hour. The kitchen staff were gone. The laundresses were done. The other clerks had left. Only Clara was still inside, and the tea was placed precisely where a guard would see it when he arrived, and it was still warm, which meant she had set it there minutes ago, which meant she had known what time he arrived and had planned accordingly. Leo picked up the cup. The tea was good. Not great. Palace grade, which meant it was several steps above what the guard barracks served, which was technically a liquid, but only in the sense that regret is technically an emotion. He drank it standing at his post. He left the empty cup on the ledge. The next morning, it was gone. The following night, a new cup was waiting. He did not mention it. She did not mention it. It became a fact of the corridor, like the draft from the high windows, or the way the stone floor echoed footsteps differently after midnight, when the palace's heat faded, and the walls contracted, and everything sounded sharper and more alone. On the 16th night, Leo arrived at his post, and found the cup, and something else. A folded piece of paper tucked beneath it. He unfolded it, and read a single line, written in small, precise handwriting. "The door hinge has not squeaked since you reported it. This is apparently a rare event." He read it 3 times. Then he folded it and put it in his pocket, and stood at his post, and thought that if he were a smarter man, he would stop whatever was happening right now, because whatever was happening was not part of the plan. The plan was to move through the palace and meet people and evaluate compatibility and find someone who could love a man without a title. The plan was not to stand outside a single door for 16 consecutive nights and fall slowly and completely for a woman who communicated through tea and folded notes and the precise calibration of her walking path. But Leo was not a smarter man. He was a man standing in a hallway holding a piece of paper that smelled like old books, and the warmth in his chest had expanded to the point where it was pressing against his ribs, and he knew with the certainty of someone who has been waiting for a specific feeling his entire life that this was it. This was the feeling, not the grand, theatrical version the court poets wrote about. The small, accumulating version. The version that builds itself one cup of tea at a time. He was in trouble. The beautiful, terrifying, irreversible kind. The monsoon arrived 3 days early. The palace weather watchers had predicted it for Friday. It came Tuesday. Not gently. Not as a gradual darkening of the sky and a polite increase in wind, but as a wall. A physical, vertical wall of water that dropped onto the palace grounds like the sky had been holding its breath for months and finally lost the argument with gravity. Leo was at his post when it hit. The eastern corridor had windows set high in the walls, narrow things designed for ventilation rather than light, and within the first hour of the storm, water was coming through every one of them. The floor turned slick, the air turned heavy. The sound was enormous, a roaring that swallowed conversations and footsteps and the normal quiet rhythms of the corridor, and replaced them with a single, unbroken noise that felt less like weather and more like a judgment. He was not worried about the corridor. He was worried about the door behind him. The records hall was old. The oldest part of the eastern wing, built 60 years before the rest of the corridor, with a roof that had been patched rather than replaced, because the records hall was not a priority, and the budget for non-priority repairs had been cut every year for the last decade, by a treasury department that considered the archives a polite word for storage. At 2 in the morning, the roof gave way. Not the whole roof. A section above the northwest corner, where 3 centuries of judicial transcripts were shelved. The sound was sharp, a crack, followed by a groan, followed by the specific, terrible noise of water meeting paper at volume. Leo heard it through the door. He opened the door. The records hall was dark except for a single lamp burning on the central table, and in its light, he could see water pouring through a gap in the ceiling, in a steady, thick column that was already soaking the top shelves and cascading down to the lower ones. Volumes were darkening, pages were swelling, ink was beginning to run, and the knowledge contained in those documents was dissolving in real time, letter by letter, word by word, century by century. Clara was already inside. She was standing on a chair she had dragged to the nearest shelf, pulling volumes from the top row, and passing them down to a stack she had started on the central table, which was the only dry surface in the room. She was soaked. Her hair had come loose from its pins, and hung in dark ropes against her neck. Her dress was plastered to her shoulders. She was working with the controlled urgency of someone who understood that panic was a luxury she could not afford, because the documents would not save themselves. She saw him in the doorway. For 1 second, their eyes met, and in that second, Leo saw something he had not seen in her before. Not fear, not gratitude, calculation. She was calculating whether he was useful. He did not wait for her to decide. He crossed the room in 4 strides, grabbed a stack of volumes from the endangered shelf, and carried them to the table. Then he went back. And again. And again. They did not speak. There was no time for speaking, and nothing to say that the work was not already saying. The water was coming faster. The gap in the roof was widening. Every minute they spent in the room was a minute more of their clothes, absorbing cold water, and their hands going numb against wet leather bindings, and their feet sliding on a floor that was becoming a shallow pool. Clara directed the operation without words. A pointed finger toward a shelf. A head shake when he reached for a section that was already too far gone. A nod when he found the right priority. She knew every volume in the room. She knew which ones mattered, and which ones were copies, and which ones contained information that existed nowhere else in the kingdom. She was triaging 3 centuries of records, with the precision of a battlefield medic deciding who could be saved. They worked for 4 hours. By the time the storm eased enough for the water to slow to a drip, they had moved 214 volumes to the central table and the adjacent reading desks. Leo counted them later. 214 leather-bound books, each one heavy enough to make his arms ache, each one carried by hand across a flooded room in the dark while the building leaked around them. The 4 senior archivists arrived at dawn. They had not come during the storm. Leo noticed this, and he could see that Clara noticed it too, and neither of them said anything about it, because the absence spoke for itself. Clara was standing beside the central table, cataloging the damage to the volumes that had been reached too late, when Leo walked over. His uniform was soaked through, his boots squelched with every step. He could not feel 3 of his fingers on his left hand. "Are you all right?" he asked. She looked at him. Not through him. Not around him. At him. For the first time since the door hinge, she was looking at him with the full weight of her attention, and it landed on him like a hand pressing against his chest. "You left your post," she said. "Yes. You could be disciplined for that." "Yes." "Why did you come in?" Leo considered lying. Considered saying something about duty or obligation, or the general principle that a guard should respond to an emergency in his assigned area. All of those things were true, and none of them were the answer. "Because you were in here alone," he said. Clara stared at him for 3 seconds. Leo counted. 3 seconds of a gaze that was not warm, but was not cold. It was measuring. She was fitting this piece of information into the framework she had built, the one that sorted people into categories based on what they did when no one important was watching, and she was deciding where he belonged. She did not tell him where she filed him. She turned back to her damaged volumes and said, "Some of these can be dried. The ink is stable if we keep them flat and open. I need materials. Blotting paper. Wooden boards for pressing. Clean cloth." "I will get them," Leo said. He spent the next 3 hours raiding the palace supply rooms. Blotting paper from the correspondence office. Boards from the carpentry workshop. Clean cloth from the laundry, where the staff looked at him like he had lost his mind because he was a soaking wet guard, requesting linens at 6 in the morning, and could not explain why, without revealing that he cared more about 300-year-old tax records than any reasonable border guard should. He brought everything back. Clara had already laid out a drying system on the reading desks, volumes open to their most damaged pages, organized by severity. She took the materials from him, examined them, and said, "The boards are too rough. They will leave marks on the pages. Can you sand them?" Leo had never sanded anything in his life. Emre Cole had probably sanded things. Emre Cole's father was a tanner, and tanners worked with their hands, and a man raised in a workshop would know how to smooth a surface. "Yes," Leo said. He found sandpaper in the carpentry workshop, and spent the next hour sanding boards smooth enough to press wet pages without damaging them. His hands blistered. The blisters opened. He sanded through them because Emre Cole would have sanded through them, and because Clara was watching him through the doorway with an expression that he could not read, but that he wanted to be worthy of. When he brought the boards back, she ran her thumb across one, checked the smoothness, nodded. "These are good," she said. 2 words, 2 ordinary words. They hit him with the force of every compliment he had ever received in the throne room. Every diplomatic flattery, every courtier's praise, combined and compressed into a single moment of genuine approval from a woman who did not give it unless it was earned. They spent the rest of the day saving documents, working side by side in a room that smelled like wet stone and old paper, with the pale gray light of a post-storm morning filtering through the high windows and casting everything in a color that made the room look like it existed outside of time. Clara talked while they worked, not personal talk, practical talk. She explained the filing system, the organizational logic of the archives, the way judicial transcripts were cross-referenced with land deeds, and how tax records from different decades could reveal patterns in wealth distribution that no single document could show. She spoke about it the way other people spoke about things they loved, not with passion, which was loud and temporary, but with authority, which was quiet and permanent. Leo asked questions, careful ones, the kind a curious border guard might ask, but the questions kept drifting into territory that Emre Cole should not have known existed. He asked about the judicial review process, about how land disputes were arbitrated, about the relationship between provincial tax collection and central treasury allocation. Clara answered all of them, and as she answered, Leo saw something shift in her posture, a straightening, a loosening. She was talking to someone who was listening, not politely, not performatively, but with the focused engagement of a person who understood the significance of what she was saying. And that experience, the experience of being heard by someone who comprehended, was so rare in her life that it changed her physically. She stood taller, her hands moved when she spoke, her voice gained a warmth that had not been there before. not directed at him specifically, but at the space between them, which had become a space where her knowledge mattered. Leo watched this transformation and felt two things simultaneously: joy, because he was seeing her unfold, and guilt, because the person she was unfolding for did not exist. Emre Cole was fiction, a careful, constructed fiction designed to strip away the noise of royalty and reveal the signal beneath. But what Leo had not anticipated was that the fiction would develop its own gravity. Clara was not responding to him. She was responding to Emre, to the border guard who sanded boards without complaint and stood in hallways without expectation, and listened to her talk about tax records with the attention most men reserved for things they wanted. She liked Emre, and Emre did not exist. The day ended at dusk. Clara locked the records hall, something she had apparently never bothered to do before, and stood in the corridor beside Leo's post. The distance between them was smaller than it had ever been. 2 feet, close enough that he could smell the damp paper and old ink that clung to her clothes like perfume. "Thank you," she said, "for tonight, and the morning, and the boards. You do not need to thank me. I know I do not need to. I am choosing to. There is a difference." She walked away down the corridor. Leo watched her go and thought about choices, about the ones she made, carefully and deliberately and on her own terms, about the ones he had made, recklessly and desperately, and with the growing awareness that he was building something on a foundation of lies. The next morning, he found a cup of tea at his post. Beside it, not a folded note this time, but a small, leather-bound volume. He opened it. It was a registry of Palace Guard service records from 40 years ago. Inside the front cover, written in Clara's small, precise hand, was a single sentence: "In case you want to know who stood where you are standing." He read it during his shift. 40 years of guards who had been assigned to the Eastern Corridor. Names, dates, transfers, promotions. A few notes on conduct. One entry for a guard who had served the corridor for 22 years and retired without ever being mentioned in a single official report. 22 years of standing in a hallway, and the only proof he had existed was a line in a book that no one read. Leo closed the book and held it against his chest and stood in the hallway and thought about legacies. The king left statues, the generals left victories, the nobles left estates, the guards left lines in books, and the clerks who kept the books were the only ones who remembered. From that night forward, the tea was accompanied by conversation. Not long. 5 minutes at the start of her shift. 5 minutes at the end. Clara stood in the doorway, leaning against the frame with her arms crossed over her satchel, and talked. About the archives, about the documents she was working with, about the patterns she was finding in the records that nobody had asked her to find, and nobody knew she was building. She had been quietly, methodically constructing a cross-referenced index of the kingdom's judicial and financial records, a project no one had assigned, a project that, if completed, would create the first comprehensive, searchable record of Aldara's governance in the kingdom's history. She had been working on it for 3 years, in her own time, with her own system, without telling anyone, because the last time she had suggested it to the head archivist, he had smiled the smile that men smile when a woman proposes something ambitious and said, "That is a very large undertaking for someone at your level." She had not proposed it again. She had simply started doing it. Leo listened to this and felt a specific kind of anger that he recognized from his years in court. Not the hot, reactive anger of an insult, the cold, structural anger of watching a system waste its own resources because the person offering them did not have the right title. "Why do you stay?" he asked her one evening. "If they do not see what you are doing, if no one asked, if no one cares, why do you keep doing it?" Clara looked at him with an expression that contained more than one thing: amusement, annoyance, and underneath both, something harder and older. "Because the records do not care who filed them," she said. "A land deed works the same whether a lord handled it or a clerk's daughter. The information does not know it is supposed to be beneath me. It just is." Leo opened his mouth and closed it again, because the thing he wanted to say was not something Emre Cole would say. Emre Cole would nod and agree and move on. But the thing Leo wanted to say was, "You are the most qualified person I have ever met for a position that does not yet exist, and when I am king, I will create it." He said nothing. He drank his tea. He listened to her footsteps fade down the corridor, and he stood in the hallway with the guard registry pressed against his chest and felt the lie growing heavier by the day. A tumor in the center of something good, getting bigger, getting harder to ignore, getting closer to the moment when it would either need to be removed or would kill the thing it was growing inside. Philip's coded messages arrived weekly, hidden in the supply manifests that came to the barracks, buried in the lists of boot sizes and uniform requisitions, in a cipher that only Leo and Philip knew. The latest one said, "Victor is hosting dinners. 7 noble families attended last week. He is framing your absence as desertion. You have 10 weeks left. Move faster." Leo read the message, burned it, stood at his post. Move faster. He looked at the door of the records hall, where a woman who did not know his name was building something no one had asked for, because she believed the work mattered more than the credit. Move faster was not an option. Some things could only be built at the speed of trust. The 5 minutes became 10, the 10 became 20, and then the 20 stopped being measured at all, because somewhere in the 4th week, Clara stopped checking the clock when she talked to him, and Leo stopped pretending he was not waiting for her to start. They talked about the kingdom, about the tax system that Clara called a beautiful disaster, a phrase Leo would remember for the rest of his life, because it contained more political insight than anything he had heard in a decade of council meetings. The system was beautiful because it was intricate, layered, refined over centuries by administrators who understood the mechanics of revenue collection, the way engineers understood bridges. It was a disaster because the intricacy had become its own purpose. The system served itself, the people it was designed to fund, the farmers, the laborers, the market workers who paid into the treasury with every transaction, had become invisible inside the mathematics. They were numbers in columns, not citizens. "The records show it," Clara said one night, leaning against the doorframe with the lamp behind her, casting her shadow long across the corridor floor. "If you read the tax rolls from 50 years ago and compare them to the ones from today, the average household contribution has increased by 40%. But the services funded by those contributions, the roads, the water systems, the rural courts, have decreased by 20. The money is going somewhere. It is not going where it is supposed to go." Leo said, "Where is it going?" And Clara gave him a look that said she knew exactly where it was going, but was not going to say it out loud to a palace guard, because palace guards reported to captains, and captains reported to officers, and officers reported to people who did not want a filing clerk asking questions about missing money. "Read the records," she said. "The answer is in the noble expense accounts from the last 2 decades. If anyone ever bothered to cross-reference them with the treasury disbursements, the pattern would be obvious. Have you cross-referenced them?" "I cross-reference everything. It is what I do." She said it lightly, like a joke, but her eyes were not joking, and Leo understood that Clara Whitmore was sitting on information that could restructure the kingdom's financial governance, and she was sitting on it because no one with the authority to act on it would ever take a meeting with a records hall clerk. He wanted to tell her. The urge was physical, a pressure behind his sternum that built every time she said something that confirmed she was not just intelligent, but visionary. She did not see the kingdom from above, the way kings and generals saw it. She saw it from below, from the level of the paper. And from that level, the view was clearer, because the paper did not lie. People lied, advisors lied, reports lied, but the raw numbers, the original documents, the ink and paper record of every transaction and every ruling, those told the truth because no one had ever thought they were important enough to falsify. Clara had found a weapon hiding in the archives. She just did not know she was holding it. Their conversations drifted, not always policy. Sometimes she talked about her father, Walter Whitmore, a palace clerk who had worked in the correspondence office for 20 years, handling letters between the crown and the provincial governors. He had died when Clara was 12, a winter fever that took him in a week, the way winter fevers did in the lower quarters of the palace, where the heating was poor and the medical care was an afterthought. She did not talk about it with emotion. She talked about it with precision. The date, the sequence of symptoms, the name of the physician who had arrived too late because the physician served the upper palace first and the lower palace second, and by the time he reached Walter Whitmore's bedside, the fever had already won. "He taught me to read the records," Clara said. "Not just read, understand. He said that every document in the archives was a decision someone made, and if you could see the decision, you could see the person, and if you could see enough persons, you could see the system. Leo listened. He did not respond with sympathy, because Clara was not asking for sympathy. She was giving him context. She was explaining how a clerk's daughter had ended up in the deepest room of the palace, surrounded by centuries of paper, building an index that no one had requested, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. It was the most natural thing in the world. She was finishing her father's work. He understood this the way you understand a structural truth. Not with your mind first, but with your body. A tightening in the chest, a settling of weight. The recognition that the person standing in front of you is doing something that matters, in a way that transcends job descriptions and salary grades, and the arbitrary hierarchies that determine who gets heard and who gets filed. He had been in the palace for a month. He had 4 weeks of shifts and porridge and blistered hands and cold corridors behind him, and 3 months of borrowed time ahead of him. And somewhere in the space between those two numbers, he had fallen for a woman who loved paper more than people, and he could not tell her who he was without destroying the only version of himself she had ever liked. The lie was getting heavy. It moved into his body, into the tension between his shoulders that would not release, into the way he caught himself mid-sentence, swerving away from knowledge that Emre Cole should not have, into the nightly ritual of lying on his cot and reviewing every conversation for cracks, for moments where the mask had slipped and something royal had leaked through the fabric of the disguise. There had been close calls. He had referred to the Council of Houses by its formal name, which a border guard from Thornfeld would not have known. Clara had not noticed, or if she had not mentioned it. He had used the word allocate in a conversation about grain distribution, a word that belonged in a budget meeting, not in a hallway, and Clara's eyes had flickered, but she had moved on. Each slip was a hairline fracture, individually invisible. Collectively, they were forming a pattern, and Clara was a woman who saw patterns. He started testing her, carefully, indirectly, the way you test ice, by tapping before you step. "What do you think of the prince?" he asked one night. Clara was sorting correspondence logs on the table inside the records hall, her back to him, the door propped open so they could talk while she worked. She did not turn around. "Which one?" "The Crown Prince. Leo." "I do not think about him." "At all?" "At all. He is a name in the succession records, an entry in the royal registry. Born here, educated here, trained here. Everything you would expect from someone whose entire life was arranged before he could walk. I have no opinion about him because I have never seen anything that was actually him, just the shape of what the crown requires." Leo stood in the corridor and absorbed this sentence like a blow to the sternum, not because it was cruel, because it was accurate. She had never seen him. No one had ever seen him. The crown was not just a hat, it was a filter. Everything that passed through it, every word, every gesture, every public appearance, was transformed by the filter into something that served the institution rather than the individual. She was right. There was nothing of him visible from the outside. The crown had done its job too well. "Do you think he would be a good king?" he asked. "I think the question is irrelevant." "How is that irrelevant?" Clara turned around. She had a pen behind her ear, the way she always did when she was deep in cataloging work, and it made her look like a portrait of someone who had been caught between thoughts. "Because it does not matter whether a king is good. It matters whether the systems around him are good. A good king with bad systems will fail. A mediocre king with good systems will succeed. The monarchy is not a person. It is a structure, and structures outlast persons." Leo opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "That is the most Republican thing I have ever heard someone say inside a royal palace." Clara shrugged. The shrug of someone who had thought about it long enough that being called a Republican felt like being called tall. A description, not an insult. "The records support it," she said. "The best periods in Aldara's history were not under the best kings. They were under the kings who built the best institutions. Courts that functioned independently, tax systems that were transparent, archives that were maintained and accessible. The king is a figurehead, the structure is the government." She turned back to her logs. Leo stood in the corridor and stared at the wall opposite him, and felt something rearranging itself inside his understanding of the world. Not a new idea, a confirmation. The thing he had always suspected but never heard spoken aloud, because the people around him had a vested interest in the mythology of royal greatness and no incentive to challenge it. Clara had no such vested interest. Clara worked with paper, and paper, as she had told him more than once, did not care who was king. "Would you change it?" he asked. "If you could. The system, the monarchy. Would you change it?" She did not turn around this time. "I am a filing clerk in an archive that no one visits. The question of what I would change is theoretical to the point of comedy. Humor me." She was quiet for a long time, long enough that Leo thought she had decided not to answer. Then she said, without turning, "I would make the records public. Public. Every land deed, every tax record, every judicial ruling. Public, available to any citizen who wanted to read them. Not because transparency is a moral virtue, although it is, but because the single greatest source of corruption in this kingdom is the assumption that information belongs to the people who hold it. It does not. It belongs to the people it describes." Leo gripped the doorframe. "That would end careers," he said. "Noble houses have built fortunes on the assumption that their financial records are private." "Yes," Clara said. "It would." The simplicity of her agreement was staggering. She was not naive. She understood the consequences. She simply believed the consequences were correct. Leo stood in the doorway and watched her work, and felt the last remaining barrier between interest and devotion dissolve like wet paper in a monsoon flood. He was not falling for her anymore. He had fallen, past tense, complete. The impact had already happened, and what he was experiencing now was not the fall but the aftermath, the rearrangement of everything that had been displaced by the landing. He loved her. Not the way the court poets described it, with thunderbolts and destiny and two souls recognizing each other across a crowded room. He loved her the way a person loves a truth they have been searching for, without knowing what it looked like. She was not a mirror. She was a window. And through her, he could see a version of the kingdom, and a version of himself within it, that made the crown worth wearing. The problem was that the version of himself she was seeing through her own window was a fiction named Emre Cole, who sanded boards, and stood in hallways, and drank tea from cups left on stone ledges. And the distance between that fiction and the truth was growing wider every day, and at some point, the gap would become too large to cross, and he would have to choose. The truth, which would destroy what they had, or the lie, which would preserve it as long as it lasted, and then destroy it worse. He chose neither. He chose delay, the coward's third option, the one that felt like patience but was actually fear, wearing a better outfit. Philip's next message arrived in the boot requisition. It was shorter than the others. 5 words. "Victor knows you are gone." Leo read it standing in the supply room, with boot polish on his fingers, and the smell of leather in his nose, and a cold knot forming in his stomach that had nothing to do with the temperature. Victor knew. Not where, not why, but the absence had been noticed by the one person in the kingdom who could turn an absence into a weapon. The clock was no longer bleeding. It was hemorrhaging. And Leo was standing in a hallway, holding a supply manifest that contained a coded warning, watching a woman through a doorway who did not know his name, and realizing that the plan he had designed to find love had succeeded in the worst possible way. He had found it. And it was built on a foundation that was already cracking. That night, after his shift ended, and the corridor was empty, and the palace had settled into the deep, humming quiet of 3 a.m, Leo walked to the barracks and sat on his cot, and did something he had not done since he was a child. He talked to his mother. Not out loud, in his head. The way he used to when she was alive, and he was too young to say the things he needed to say, and too old to admit he needed to say them. He sat in the dark and asked Catherine, who had married a crown and spent 30 years paying for it, what he was supposed to do with a woman who hated the crown on principle and loved a man who did not exist. Catherine did not answer. She had never answered, but the act of asking was the prayer, and the silence afterward was the space where clarity sometimes lived. He did not find clarity that night. He found something smaller and more useful. Resolve. He would tell her. Not now. Not yet. The timing had to be right. and the circumstances had to be controlled, and the ground had to be prepared so that when the truth came, it would land on something solid rather than shatter against something fragile. He would tell her the truth. He just needed to figure out how to do it without losing everything the lie had built. The conversation that changed the trajectory happened on a Tuesday, not because Tuesday was significant, but because Tuesdays were Clara's longest shifts, and by the end of them, she was tired enough to say things she would not say on a Monday. They were standing in the corridor at the end of her shift. The lamps had burned down to their final inch of wick, and the light was the color of honey, left too long in the jar, thick and amber, and not quite enough to see by. Clara was leaning against the doorframe, which had become her spot, the way the stone ledge had become Leo's spot for the tea, and they were talking about inheritance law. Most people did not talk about inheritance law at 11 at night in a dimly lit hallway, but Clara and Leo were not most people, and the subject had come up because Clara had found a series of land transfers from 30 years ago that did not match the judicial rulings that should have authorized them. Estates had changed hands without due process, fortunes had been redirected without hearings, and the families that had benefited were, without exception, the same families that currently sat on the Council of Houses and voted on the kingdom's laws. "It is not even hidden well," Clara said. "The records are right there, filed correctly, dated correctly, cross-referenced with the original ownership documents. Someone 30 years ago either did not think anyone would look or did not care if they did. The arrogance of it is almost admirable. What would happen if someone brought this to the council?" Clara laughed. Not a happy laugh. The laugh of someone who has run a calculation, and the answer is 0. The council would investigate itself, using its own appointed judges, reviewing its own records, and reaching its own conclusions. The finding would be that the transfers were lawful, under a provision that no longer exists, but was technically valid at the time, and the matter would be closed, and the person who raised it would be transferred to a provincial archive in a town no one can find on a map. "You sound like you have thought about this." "I think about everything, Emre. It is the only exercise available to someone with access to the truth and no authority to act on it." Emre, she used his name now, had been using it for a week. Every time she said it, Leo felt the word land on him, like a hand placed on a wound. Warm, gentle, on the wrong body. What if someone with authority acted on it, he asked. Someone with authority already knows. That is the problem. Authority and knowledge are not separated in this kingdom. The people who have the power to change things are the same people who benefit from things staying the same. The king could act. The king will not act because the king needs the council, and the council needs the king, and the arrangement works for everyone inside it. It only fails the people outside it, and the people outside it do not have a voice loud enough to be heard through the walls of this palace. She pushed off the doorframe and stood straight, tired. The kind of tiredness that is not physical but structural, the tiredness of a person who sees a problem clearly and knows that seeing it is not the same as solving it. "I should go," she said. "Clara." She stopped. Leo chose his next words with the precision of a man diffusing a device that could blow up in his face. If someone with authority wanted to act, if someone who was not part of the system wanted to use what you have found, would you trust them with it? She looked at him for a long time, long enough for the lamp to flicker twice and the corridor to darken and brighten and darken again. "Trust is not a thing I hand out, Emre. It is a thing people earn, and no one with authority has ever earned it from me." She walked away. Leo stood in the corridor and felt the weight of what she had said settle into his bones. No one with authority had ever earned her trust. Not the archivists who dismissed her work. Not the guards who used her for entertainment. Not the system that had let her father die because he was not high enough in the building to deserve timely medical care. She had learned, through a lifetime of evidence, that power was either indifferent to her or actively harmful, and the safest response was to keep her knowledge close and her expectations low. The burrito was cold, and he was going to ask her to trust a king. The irony was so thick he could have choked on it. He returned to the barracks and found Simon awake, sitting on his cot with a lamp and a letter that he folded shut the moment Leo entered. Simon was private about his letters. Leo had learned not to ask. "You look like a man who has been thinking too hard," Simon said. "I have been talking to Clara. I know. The whole corridor knows. The tea. the conversations, the way you stand at that post, like a man waiting for a religious experience. It is not subtle. Leo sat on his cot. Is it a problem? For you, yes. For her, I am not sure. She has not talked to a guard since Derek. The fact that she is talking to you means something, but I do not know if it means what you want it to mean. What do I want it to mean? Simon gave him the look that experienced men give inexperienced ones. The look that says, I will answer your question, but we both know you already have the answer. You want it to mean she sees you. Not the uniform, you. Leo said nothing. Because Simon was right, and the truth of it was both simpler and more complicated than anything he could say out loud. He wanted Clara to see him. But the him she was seeing was a construction. A character he had built from necessity and desperation, and the genuine desire to exist outside the gravitational field of his own title. And the character had become so real, so inhabited, so layered with genuine experience, that Leo was no longer sure where Emre ended and Leo began. Was the man who sanded boards and stood in hallways and drank tea from cups left on stone ledges a fiction, or was he the truth that the crown had been covering? He did not know, and the not knowing was its own kind of vertigo. The next night, Clara was different. Not obviously, not in a way that a casual observer would notice, but Leo had spent 5 weeks calibrating himself to her frequencies, and he could feel the shift the way a sailor feels a change in wind before the sails move. She was quicker with her words. Sharper. She asked questions she had not asked before. Where in Thornfeld were you posted? The Eastern Ridge. Border Watchtower. How many men in your unit? 12. And the commanding officer? Captain Marsh? Yes. What was he like? Leo had prepared for this question. Philip had briefed him on Marsh, a real man, a real captain, with a real personality, that Leo had memorized the way an actor memorizes a role. Strict, fair, did not talk much, led by example. How long did you serve under him? 3 years. Clara nodded, the nod of someone filing information, not accepting it. Leo recognized the motion, because it was the same motion she used in the archives when she was adding a piece of data to a pattern she was still building. She was not satisfied. She was collecting. You know a lot about governance, she said. For a border guard. There it was, the crack he had been dreading. Not a confrontation, something worse. A question disguised as an observation, placed gently on the table between them, waiting to see if he would pick it up or pretend it was not there. My father was a tanner, Leo said. But he read. He had a shelf of books about governance that he bought from a traveling merchant. Old ones, out of date. But the principles were there. I read them growing up, because there was nothing else to read. The lie came smoothly, too smoothly. He had told enough lies in court to know the mechanics, the specific detail that makes a story believable, the casual delivery that signals confidence, the just enough vulnerability of a man admitting his father's pretensions. He was good at lying. He hated that he was good at lying. Clara watched him while he spoke. She did not challenge the story. She did not probe it. She let it sit in the air between them, and Leo could not tell whether she had accepted it or placed it on the shelf next to the other pieces she was collecting. My father read too, she said. He said reading was the only rebellion available to people who could not afford a sword. Leo laughed, a real laugh, the kind that escaped before he could shape it into something appropriate for Emre Cole. It was too warm, too textured, the laugh of a man who had been educated by the finest tutors in the kingdom and knew exactly how good that line was. Clara smiled, small, controlled, but real. And Leo felt the ground shift under him again, and this time, it did not shift back. Philip's next message was not coded. It arrived in person. The general appeared at the barracks at midnight, dressed in civilian clothes, looking like a wardrobe that had been draped in linen, and sent on an errand it disapproved of. Leo met him behind the building, in the shadow of the eastern wall, where the lamps did not reach, and the only light came from the half-moon hanging over the palace, like a surveillance device that could not quite see enough. Victor is accelerating, Philip said. No greeting, no preamble. Philip did not waste words any more than a surgeon wasted incisions. How? He hosted a dinner last week for 9 noble families. The ones who signed the succession petition are already committed. He is working on the remaining 5. He has also been spending time in the Eastern Wing. Leo's stomach dropped. The Eastern Wing. He toured the kitchens 2 days ago, spoke with the staff, shook hands. A charm offensive, aimed at the people who run the building. It is smart. If he can claim popular support from the palace workforce, the council will have additional justification to transfer the succession. He did not come to the corridor? Not yet, but he will. He is working his way through the wings systematically. Leo pressed his back against the wall. The stone was cold. The cold felt appropriate. There is something else, Philip said. He has a man, Edmund. Former military intelligence. Discharged under circumstances that were never fully explained. Victor hired him 3 months ago as a personal security advisor. The official title is meaningless. He is a spy. Spying on what? On everything. On you. On the gaps in your cover. On the reason why a border guard named Emre Cole appeared in the palace records at exactly the same time the crown prince disappeared from public life. Leo closed his eyes. How much does Edmund know? I do not know what he knows. I know what he is looking for. He has been pulling service records from the eastern border, requesting verification from the outposts. Captain Marsh's cooperation is holding, but it will not hold if Edmund applies direct pressure. Marsh is loyal, but he is not built for interrogation. How long do I have? Before the cover breaks? 2 weeks, maybe 3. Before Victor presents the succession petition to the council? 6 weeks. 2 weeks, maybe 3. Against the 6 weeks he needed. The mathematics of it were brutal. He was running out of one timeline while being crushed by another, and somewhere between the two, a woman was standing in a records hall building an index of the kingdom's entire history, and she did not know that the man she was building something fragile and genuine with was a lie wrapped in a borrowed uniform. I need more time, Leo said. Time is the one thing I cannot manufacture. I can delay. I can misdirect. I can send Edmund chasing false leads. But delays have limits, and misdirection has a shelf life, and eventually, the truth is the only thing left in the room. Leo knew this. He had always known this. The plan had always had an expiration date. He had just not expected to care this much about what happened when it expired. There is one more thing, Philip said. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper. This arrived from the king's chambers, unofficial. His handmaid brought it to me. Leo unfolded it. His father's handwriting, shaky now, the letters uneven, in a way they had not been a year ago. I hope you are finding what you are looking for. Come home soon. I am running out of time to give. Leo folded the letter, put it in his pocket, stood in the shadow of the eastern wall, and felt the world pressing in from every direction, squeezing the space between who he was and who he was pretending to be, until there was almost no room left for the person he was trying to become. I will come home, he said, when it is time. When will it be time? Leo looked at the palace, at the lit windows of the upper floors, where the court was sleeping, at the dark windows of the eastern wing, where the servants and clerks and archivists lived and worked and built things that no one noticed. When I have something worth coming home for. Philip studied him for a long moment. Then the general nodded, once, and walked away into the dark. His footsteps faded, the shadow swallowed him, and Leo stood alone behind the barracks and felt the weight of 2 lives pressing on his shoulders, and wondered which one he would have to drop first. He went back inside, lay on his cot, stared at the ceiling. From the next cot, Simon's voice came out of the dark. Trouble? Just thinking. You think too much for a border guard, Cole. Leo almost laughed. Almost. Go to sleep, Simon said. Whatever it is, it will still be there in the morning. The thing about trouble is, it never leaves before you do. Leo closed his eyes. Simon was right. The trouble would still be there in the morning. And the morning after. And the morning after that. Building, accumulating, growing toward a collision that he could feel coming the way you can feel a storm before the sky changes color. He had weeks, maybe less. And the woman he loved did not know his name. Victor came to the eastern wing on a Thursday. Leo was at his post when the noise started. Not a loud noise, the specific, rustling noise of importance approaching. The sound of people adjusting themselves, straightening uniforms, clearing throats, arranging their faces into expressions of respectful attention. The sound the palace made when someone who mattered was about to walk through a space where no one important ever went. Victor appeared at the end of the corridor with an entourage of 3. 2 guards, not barracks guards but personal security, the kind that wore polished boots and carried swords that had never been used for anything except looking sharp. Behind them, a man Leo did not recognize. Thin, quiet, moving with the economy of motion that professional observers develop, the ability to see everything, while appearing to look at nothing. Edmund. It had to be Edmund. Victor walked the corridor slowly. He stopped at each post, each doorway, each junction. He spoke to the staff. He shook hands. He smiled, and his smile was the most dangerous thing about him because it was not fake. That was what made Victor terrifying. His warmth was genuine. His interest was genuine. His desire to connect with people was genuine. The cruelty was not in the method. It was in the purpose. He connected with people, the way a builder connects bricks. Not for the brick's sake, but for the wall. Leo stood at his post and controlled his breathing. The technique Philip had taught him years ago. Slow inhale through the nose. Hold. Slow exhale through the mouth. The technique soldiers used before battle. The technique prisoners used before sentencing. Victor reached him. Guard. Your Highness. Victor extended his hand. Leo took it. The handshake was firm, warm, and calibrated to communicate equality it did not contain. How long have you been posted here? Victor asked. 6 weeks, Your Highness. And before that? Thornfeld, eastern border. Thornfeld. Victor repeated the name the way he repeated everything, as if he were tasting it, checking its quality, deciding whether to swallow or spit. Long way from the capital. How are you finding the adjustment? Adequate, Your Highness. Victor smiled. The smile that said, I see you, and I am not threatened by you, and therefore you can relax. Leo did not relax. He had seen this smile at court 100 times, deployed against foreign diplomats and nervous courtiers, and anyone whose guard Victor wanted to lower. Well, keep up the good work. The Eastern Wing does not get enough recognition. Victor moved on. His hand released Leo's. His attention shifted to the next post, the next doorway, the next handshake. But Edmund did not move on. Edmund stopped. He looked at Leo the way a locksmith looks at a lock. Not at the surface, at the mechanism, at the internal arrangement of pins and tumblers and the specific combination that would open it. Cole, Edmund said, reading the name from the duty roster on the wall. Emre Cole. Yes, sir. Thornfeld. Yes, sir. Edmund nodded, the nod of someone making a note, not on paper, in his head, where it was safer and harder to find. He followed Victor down the corridor. Leo watched them go and felt the cold knot in his stomach tighten into something that was no longer a knot, but a fist. Edmund knew something, or suspected something. The pause had been too long, the look had been too focused. A morale tour guard check did not require that level of scrutiny. Edmund had been told to watch for something specific, and whatever that something was, Leo's face or his name or his posting had flagged it. The clock had just accelerated. He needed to warn Philip. He needed to reinforce the cover. He needed to prepare contingencies for the moment when the disguise collapsed, because it was no longer a question of whether it would collapse but when, and how violently. And he needed to tell Clara. Not the whole truth, not yet, but something. A seed. A preparation. Something that would soften the ground so that when the full truth landed, it would not shatter everything beyond repair. He found her in the records hall at the end of her shift. She was bent over a stack of judicial transcripts from the western provinces, making notes in the margins of her index, with the focused intensity of a woman who had forgotten that time existed and would resent being reminded. Clara. She looked up. You look like you ate something that fought back. I need to tell you something. She set down her pen. The act of setting down the pen was, for Clara, the equivalent of another person giving their full attention. The pen was always in her hand. The pen was her tether to the work. Setting it down meant she was here, fully, in this conversation, and whatever he said next would receive the full weight of her analytical mind. Leo took a breath. I am not who you think I am. Silence. The kind of silence that has texture. He could feel it pressing against his skin. I mean, he continued, because the first sentence had been too dramatic and not specific enough. I have not been entirely honest about my background. There are things about my past that I have not told you, things that matter. Clara looked at him for a long time. Her expression was unreadable, which was itself a readable signal, because Clara's default expression was engaged and attentive, and the shift to unreadable meant she had activated a defense system. Everyone has things they have not told, she said carefully. Are you telling me now because you want to, or because something is forcing you to? The precision of the question was devastating. She had identified the two possible motivations and laid them out like tools on a surgeon's table, and she was waiting to see which one he picked up. Both, he said. Something is happening in the palace. Political. It involves the succession. I cannot explain all of it yet, but I need you to know that when the full story comes out, and it will come out, the reason I did not tell you sooner was not because I did not trust you. It was because I did not want what we have to be shaped by it. Clara's jaw tightened. A small motion. Most people would not have noticed. What we have, she repeated. Yes. And what is that, Emre? The question hung in the air. He could hear the building settling, the creak of old shelves, the distant sound of the night kitchen cleaning up. Something I did not expect, he said. Something I did not plan for. Something that became more important to me than the reason I came here. Clara picked up her pen. Not to write, to hold. The way some people hold a cup or a coin when they need something solid in their hands. You came here with a reason, she said. You are telling me now that the reason is not what I assumed. You are not asking for my trust. You are warning me that my trust is about to be tested. Yes. Then let me tell you something, Clara said. I have been in this palace for 6 years. In that time, I have been lied to by superiors, misled by colleagues, and humiliated by a man who wore the same uniform you are wearing. The one thing I learned from all of it is that warning someone you are about to hurt them does not make the hurt smaller. It just makes the person who gives the warning feel better about doing it. Leo felt the words land on him like stones. I am not trying to feel better, he said. Then what are you trying to do? I am trying to give you a choice. Before the choice gets made for you. Clara looked at him. The defense system was fully active now. The walls were up. Not the walls she had built against guards in general. A new wall. One she was building in real time, specifically for this moment. Specifically for the shape of the threat she was sensing. When this thing comes out, she said, will it change how I see you? Yes. Will I be angry? Probably. Will I have the right to be? Leo met her eyes. Yes. You will have every right. Clara nodded, once, the nod of someone who has received information and filed it in the place where it will do the most damage when the time comes. Then I will wait, she said. Not because I trust you, because I trust myself to handle whatever it is. She turned back to her transcripts, picked up her pen, started writing. The conversation was over. Leo stood in the doorway and watched her work, and felt the fracture line between his two lives widen by another degree. He had tried to prepare the ground. He had tried to soften the landing, and in doing so, he had done exactly what she had described. He had warned her that he was about to hurt her, and the warning had not made the hurt smaller. It had just given it a shape. She would be angry. She had asked the question because she already knew the answer. And whatever wall she was building now, in this moment, with her pen moving across the page and her shoulders held in a posture of studied control, that wall would be harder to get past than anything she had built before. Because this wall was not built against strangers. It was built against him. 3 days later, Victor sent Edmund back to the Eastern Wing, not with the prince this time, alone. Edmund arrived at mid-morning, carrying a clipboard and an official-looking document that Leo recognized as a staffing audit form. The kind of form that gave anyone holding it the authority to ask questions, and the cover to pretend the questions were routine. He started at the far end of the corridor. Leo watched him work his way from post to post, interviewing guards, checking documents, making notes. The interviews were brief, 2 or 3 minutes each. Routine questions about shift schedules, posting history, previous assignments. When he reached Leo's post, the routine changed. Emre Cole. Yes, sir. Transferred from Thornfeld, Eastern Border, under Captain Marsh. Yes, sir. What year did you enlist? 4 years ago. And your training post? Heathmore Barracks. Basic Infantry. Edmund made a note. His pen moved slowly. Too slowly. He was not writing, he was thinking. The pen was a prop. Heathmoor Barracks closed for renovations 3 years ago. They moved the basic infantry training to Milford during that period. Were you at Heathmoor before or after the renovation? Leo's blood cooled. This was a test. A specific, targeted, knowledge check designed to catch a story that had been built from the outside in, rather than lived from the inside out. Before, Leo said. I was in the last intake before they closed. The last intake. That would be the winter class of 4 years ago. Yes, sir. Under Captain Aldridge. Leo did not know a Captain Aldridge. He did not know if there was a Captain Aldridge. Edmund might be testing him with a real name, or a fake one, and either answer, confirmation, or denial, would reveal something. The name does not ring a bell, Leo said. The intake was large. I did not interact with all the officers. Edmund looked up from his clipboard. His eyes were the color of old iron, and they held the same warmth. Interesting, Edmund said. Most soldiers remember their training officers, even the ones they did not interact with. It is a significant experience. It was a long time ago, sir. 4 years, not so long. The silence between them was a negotiation. Edmund was pushing. Leo was holding. Both of them knew the conversation was not about training posts or intake years. It was about whether the man standing in this hallway was the man his paperwork said he was. Edmund closed his clipboard, smiled. The smile of someone who has gathered enough for now, and will be back for more. Thank you, Emre. Stay sharp. He walked away down the corridor. His footsteps were precise, measured. The footsteps of a man who controlled everything about himself, including the way his shoes struck the floor. Leo exhaled. His hands were trembling. He pressed them flat against his thighs until the trembling stopped. The cover was cracking, not broken, not yet, but cracked, the way ice cracks before it gives way, with thin lines that spread outward from a central point of pressure and meet other lines and form a web that looks stable until you put weight on it. He had days, maybe a week, before Edmund found the crack wide enough to look through. He needed a plan, not the original plan, which had been about finding love and testing character, and all the noble, naive things that a prince with too much time and too little experience had thought were important. A new plan, one that accounted for the fact that his brother was coming for the crown, his cover was failing, the woman he loved did not know his name, and the kingdom was being sold off by its own council, in transactions that a filing clerk had documented, but no one with power would ever read. He needed to stop being Emre Cole. He needed to start being Leo. But not yet. Not until the last possible moment, because the moment he became Leo again, everything Emre had built would die. The barracks, the corridor, the cup of tea on the stone ledge, the conversations about governance and paper, and the rebellion available to people who could not afford a sword. The woman who looked at him as though he were real. All of it would die the moment the crown came back. And Leo was not ready for the funeral. Victor summoned Clara on a Monday. Leo did not know about it until she came back. He was standing at his post, watching the corridor, tracking the pulse of the palace's evening routine, when she walked out of the records hall with her satchel over her shoulder, and her face arranged into an expression he had never seen on her before. Composed. Perfectly. Rigidly. Structurally composed. The kind of composure that is itself a signal. The kind that says, something has happened, and I am holding the pieces together, through force of will, and if you touch me, I will shatter. Clara. She did not stop. She walked past him, the way she had walked past him in the first week, as if he were furniture, as if the past 6 weeks of tea and conversations, and the slow, careful demolition of the wall she had built had not happened at all. She walked down the corridor and around the corner and out of sight. Leo stood at his post. His body wanted to follow her. Every muscle was tensed in the direction she had gone. But he stayed. Not because staying was the right thing to do, because following her would be the wrong thing to do. And he had learned, in 5 weeks of standing beside her door, that the wrong thing was almost always the instinctive thing. He found out what had happened the next day. Simon told him. Simon knew everything that happened in the palace, because Simon existed at the intersection of every gossip current in the building. The place where kitchen staff talked to guards, who talked to clerks, who talked to laundresses, who talked to each other, and information flowed through the network like water through cracks, finding every opening, filling every gap. Victor had summoned Clara to the upper palace to discuss archival reorganization, an official meeting, properly scheduled, properly documented, the kind of meeting that a prince had every right to request and a records clerk had no power to refuse. The meeting had lasted an hour. Clara had come back and told no one what had happened. But one of the upper palace attendants had told a kitchen worker who had told Simon that the meeting had taken place in Victor's private study, not in the official meeting room, and that Victor had dismissed his own staff before Clara arrived, and that when Clara left, she had been walking in the specific, controlled way that people walk when they are holding themselves together across a distance they need to cover before they can stop holding. Simon told Leo this while they were eating breakfast in the guards' hall. He told it flatly, without editorializing. The facts laid out in the order they had arrived, the way a good intelligence officer delivers a report. Leo set his spoon down. He set it down carefully, precisely, placing it on the table with a control that was the only thing keeping him from standing up and walking to the upper palace and doing something that would end his disguise and possibly his freedom. What did he do? Leo asked. His voice was level. His voice was level because if it was not level, it would be something else, and the something else would not be containable. I do not know the specifics. No one does. Clara has not spoken about it. But Emre, I have seen this before. Victor has a pattern. He invites women from the lower palace to private meetings. He uses his position to create a space where they cannot refuse and cannot report. And afterward, the women either transfer to a different post or they stay and never mention it. Either way, the silence is the same. How many? That I know of? 3. That the records might show? More. The records. Complaints. Filed and then withdrawn. Clara would know. The judicial transcripts in the archives would contain them. But complaints against a prince are handled by the royal judiciary, which is appointed by the crown, which means the complaints go into the system, and the system absorbs them, the way a lake absorbs a stone. They sink, they sit at the bottom, and no one dives deep enough to retrieve them. Leo stood up. Simon grabbed his wrist. Do not, Simon said. Whatever you are thinking, do not. You are a border guard. He is a prince. If you confront him, you will be arrested, discharged, and disappeared. And Clara will still be here, and the man who did whatever he did will still be a prince. And nothing will have changed except you will not be around to stand outside her door. Leo sat back down. His jaw ached. He had been clenching it without realizing. The muscles along the sides of his face were locked so tight they trembled. He spent the day in a state of suspended fury. The fury was not hot. It was not the explosive, reactive kind that burns fast and leaves ash. It was cold, structural, the kind that builds foundations, the kind that a man with a crown uses to make decisions that change institutions. He was not angry as Emre Cole. He was angry as Leo, as the crown prince of Aldara, whose brother had used his position to summon a woman to a private room and close the door and do whatever had been done behind it, as the man who would one day sit on a throne and be responsible for every person in this palace, from the highest courtier to the lowest clerk, and who had just learned that the system he was born to lead had been used as a weapon against the woman he loved. The anger was not about Clara specifically. Although it was about Clara, it was about the architecture, the structure that made it possible, the arrangement of power and silence that allowed a prince to call a clerk to his study and dismiss his staff and close the door and know, with absolute confidence, that whatever happened behind that door would never become a public problem, because the clerk would not report it, because reporting it would mean challenging a prince, and challenging a prince, in the kingdom of Aldara, was something that happened in stories, but never in courtrooms. Clara did not come to the doorway that night. Leo stood at his post and watched the closed door and listened to the sound of her working inside, the rustle of paper, the scratch of her pen, the occasional sound of a book being shelved, and he held the silence like a wound he was not allowed to bandage. The second night, the same. The door stayed closed. The tea stopped appearing. The ledge beside the door was bare. On the third night, Leo did something he had not done before. He knocked on the records hall door. The knocking was an escalation. He knew it. She would know it. Guards did not knock on the records hall door. Guards stood beside it and waited for the people inside to come out. Knocking was an assertion of presence, a declaration that the person on the other side of the door existed to the person on this side, and that existing was not enough, and proximity was not enough, and patience, which had been his strategy from the first day, was not enough anymore. The door opened. Clara stood in the gap. Her face was the same composed mask she had been wearing since Monday. No crack, no seam. The engineering was flawless. "What?" she said, not a question. A barrier. "Are you all right?" "I am working." "That is not what I asked." Clara's eyes narrowed. The narrowing was anger, and the anger was not directed at him specifically, but at the fact that he was here, asking, pushing at the door of a room she had closed, for reasons she should not have to explain to a guard, or to anyone. "You do not get to ask me that," she said. "I know." "Then why are you asking?" "Because no one else is going to." The sentence landed between them. Clara's composure flickered. A hairline crack in the mask, so thin it was almost invisible. But Leo saw it, because he had spent 6 weeks learning the geography of her face, and he knew where the fault lines were. "I do not need someone to ask," she said. "I need someone to do something, and no one will, because no one can, because the person who did it is a prince, and princes are immune to consequences in this kingdom, and if you think standing outside my door and looking concerned is going to change that, then you are as naive as every other man who has ever mistaken sympathy for action." She closed the door. Leo stood in the hallway. His blood was moving through his body in a way that he could feel, which was not normal. Blood moved invisibly, but this was different. This was blood that had been given a direction, and was moving toward it, with the focused energy of a thing that has been told where to go, and will not be redirected. He spoke through the closed door, quietly, so that only she could hear. "He will not touch you again." Not a promise, not a hope, a fact, delivered in a voice that did not belong to a border guard from Thornfeld, delivered in a voice that belonged to a man who had spent 25 years being trained to make decisions that could not be reversed. On the other side of the door, Clara went still. Leo could feel it, the way the air changed when a person stops moving. She was standing on the other side, a wooden door between them, and she had heard something in his voice that did not match. Something that sounded like authority. Not the borrowed authority of a uniform, but the inherent authority of someone who has been raised to believe that his words carry the weight of law. She did not open the door. She did not respond, but Leo heard her breathing change. From the controlled, shallow breaths of composure to something deeper, something closer to the way a person breathes when they are deciding whether to believe something impossible. Leo stepped back from the door, returned to his post, stood at attention, and began constructing, in his mind, the architecture of what would happen next. He was done playing Emre Cole, not because the disguise had failed, not because Edmund was closing in, not because the clock was running out, because a woman had been hurt by a system he was born to lead, and every second he spent pretending to be someone without power was a second she spent living in a world where the person who hurt her faced no consequences. He would tell her the truth, but first, he had work to do. That night, after his shift, he did not go to the barracks. He went to the eastern wall. He sent a coded message to Philip through the supply chain. The message was 3 words. Start the endgame. Philip would understand. The endgame was a contingency they had discussed before the disguise began. The plan for when the plan failed. The rapid, controlled demolition of the Emre Cole identity, and the restoration of Prince Leo to visible, public, undeniable existence. It involved risk. It involved exposure. It involved walking into the throne room and reclaiming the succession in front of a council that had been courted by Victor for weeks and was predisposed to view Leo's absence as abdication. But it also involved something Victor had not anticipated, something no one in the palace had anticipated, something that had been building in the archives of the records hall, organized and indexed and cross-referenced by a woman who saw patterns that no one else bothered to look for. The truth, documented, filed, waiting. Leo lay on his cot in the dark barracks and felt the 2 halves of his life moving toward each other like tectonic plates. The collision was coming. It would be violent. It would reshape everything. But on the other side of it, if he did this right, if he was careful and ruthless and precise, there would be something new. Not just a crown. A reason to wear it. He told her on a Wednesday. Not because Wednesday was the right day. Because Wednesday was the day before the endgame, and if he waited until after, she would learn the truth from a public announcement rather than from him, and that would be worse than anything he could do to her by telling her himself. He found her in the records hall at midnight. She had been working late all week, burying herself in the index project, with the intensity of someone using work as a wall between themselves and the thing they did not want to think about. The records hall was dark, except for her lamp. The older archivists had gone home hours ago. She was alone, with 3 centuries of paper, and the ghost of whatever had happened in Victor's study. Clara. She looked up. Her eyes were tired. Not the tiredness of late hours, but the tiredness of sustained vigilance. She had been holding the mask in place for a week, and the effort was starting to show at the edges. "I need to tell you something," Leo said, "and I need you to let me finish before you respond." She set down her pen. The act was slower this time. Reluctant. She knew, from his earlier warning, that something was coming. She had been waiting for it, the way a person waits for a blow they can see but cannot dodge. "Go ahead," she said. Leo closed the door. He walked to the table where she was sitting and stood across from her. The width of the table between them, stacks of judicial transcripts and tax folios, arranged in neat rows, like the walls of a city built from paper. "My name is not Emre Cole," he said. "There is no Emre Cole. The service record is a fabrication. The transfer from Thornfeld is a cover story. I have never been to Thornfeld. I have never been a border guard." Clara's face did not change. Not yet. The first sentence had landed, but the full weight of it was still falling, still descending through the layers of understanding that separated hearing from comprehending. "My name is Leo. I am the Crown Prince of Aldara, the son of King Harold, the one whose absence from public life the palace has been whispering about for 7 weeks. The weight landed. Clara's expression did not crack. It reorganized. The mask did not fall because it was not a mask she could remove. It was a structural feature, a load-bearing wall that she had built into herself after years of learning that the world would hurt her if she showed it where to aim. But behind the wall, behind the composure, behind the careful arrangement of a face trained not to betray its owner, something was happening, something tectonic. Leo could see it in her eyes, which were not looking at him anymore but through him, past him, back through 7 weeks of conversations, and cups of tea, and folded notes, and sanded boards, and a man standing in a hallway who had listened to her talk about tax records as if they mattered. She did not speak for a long time. Leo did not fill the silence. He stood on his side of the table and let the truth occupy the space between them, and waited for her to decide what to do with it. "A prince," she said. "Yes." "The Crown Prince." "Yes." "You came to the palace guard as a disguise." "Yes." "To find a wife." The word hit the air like a slap. Leo heard it the way she said it. Not as a romantic concept, as a transaction, a mission with an objective. A prince who needed a bride, dressed as a commoner, shopping among the staff. "That is how it started," he said. "And how did it end?" "It ended here, in this room, with you." Clara stood up. The motion was controlled, deliberate, the way she did everything. She placed her palms flat on the table, leaned forward, and looked at him, with an expression that contained so many things at once that Leo could not separate them. Anger, betrayal, recognition. The terrible, specific recognition of a pattern she had seen before. A man in a uniform, pretending to be something he was not. A performance of interest that served a purpose she had not been told about. "So I was an audition," she said. "No. You came here to find a wife. You found me. You tested me. You evaluated my intelligence, my character, my political opinions, my feelings about the monarchy. You let me talk, and you listened, and you made your assessment. That is an audition." "Clara, that is not what happened." "Then tell me what happened. Tell me what you call it when a man pretends to be someone he is not, builds a relationship with a woman who does not know who he is, and uses that relationship to decide whether she is suitable for a role she did not apply for. Tell me the word for that, because from where I am standing, it looks like every other time a man in this palace has decided that what I want is less important than what he needs. The words cut clean. No excess. No emotional decoration. Every sentence was a blade, honed by the same precision she applied to her index, her records, her analysis of patterns in documents that no one else read. She was dissecting him with the tools she had spent her life building, and every cut was accurate. Leo did not defend himself. There was no defense. She was right, not about the intention. The intention had shifted, genuinely, from evaluation to devotion somewhere around the third week, somewhere between the sanded boards and the folded notes, and the conversation about transparent records. But the origin was what she described. He had come here with a mission. She had been caught in it without her knowledge or consent, and no amount of genuine feeling could erase the fact that the foundation was built without her permission. "You are right," he said. Clara stared at him. She had been expecting a defense, a justification, an explanation that would make it smaller, more manageable, more forgivable. His agreement caught her off guard, and for a moment, the composure wavered, and he saw behind it. Hurt. Not anger. Hurt. The anger was the structure she had built around the hurt to make it functional. The anger was the tool she reached for when the alternative was something she could not afford. But underneath it, underneath the precision and the control and the devastating accuracy of her words, there was a woman who had opened a door she had sworn to keep shut, and the person she had opened it for had walked through it, wearing a lie. "You are right," Leo said again. "I came here with a purpose that did not include your consent. I built a false identity. I used it to enter your space. I let you trust a person who does not exist. Everything you are saying is accurate, and I have no argument against it. Then why are you telling me?" "Because tomorrow, I am reclaiming the succession. I am walking into the council chamber and revealing myself. The disguise is over. And when it ends, the entire palace will know who I am. And you will know that the man who stood outside your door for 7 weeks was a prince playing a game. And if you learn that from a public announcement instead of from me, standing here, looking you in the eye, then everything I felt in those 7 weeks is worthless. I would rather you hate me for telling you than despise me for letting you find out." Clara was quiet. The records hall was quiet. The only sound was the distant hum of the palace at night, the deep, vibrating frequency of a building full of sleeping people and working systems, and the accumulated weight of centuries of governance. "Everything you felt," Clara repeated. "What did you feel?" Leo looked at her, at the lamplight on her face, at the pen behind her ear, at the stacks of paper that surrounded her like the battlements of a castle she had built herself, from the ground up, without help, without permission, without anyone telling her she could. "I felt like I was meeting the only person in this kingdom who saw it clearly," he said. "Not the court, not the council, not the diplomatic corps, or the military, or the nobility. You, a clerk in a room full of paper. You saw the system more clearly than anyone who runs it. And the version of me that you liked, the one who stood in the hallway and drank your tea and listened to you talk about tax records at midnight, that is not a character I invented. That is the version of me that exists when nobody is watching, the one the crown hides." Clara's hands pressed harder against the table, her knuckles whitened. "That is a very pretty thing to say," she said. "And I have no way of knowing if it is true, because everything you have told me for 7 weeks has been a lie. Your name, your history, your background, the foundation of every conversation we have had is fiction. And now you are standing here telling me the feelings were real, and I am supposed to separate the feelings from the fiction, and I do not know how to do that. I do not know if anyone can do that. I am not asking you to separate them. I am asking you to be angry. Be as angry as you need to be. And then, when the anger is done, if it is ever done, look at what is left. Because I believe something is left. I believe the conversations were real, even if the name was not. I believe what you felt was real, even if the context was wrong." Clara closed her eyes. When she opened them, they were dry. She had not cried. She would not cry. Not here. Not in front of him. Not in front of a prince. "Leave the records hall," she said. Leo left. He stood outside the door for an hour. Not because he expected her to open it, because standing outside her door was the only honest thing Emre Cole had ever done, and Leo was not ready to stop being him entirely. Not yet. Not until morning. The corridor was dark. The lamps had burned out. He stood in the blackness and listened to the silence on the other side of the door, and felt the full weight of what he had done settle into his body, like concrete poured into a mold. He had told her the truth. The truth had done exactly what she said it would do. It had not made the hurt smaller. It had given it a shape, a name, a face. The face of a prince who had dressed as a commoner and walked into her life and made her believe in something that was built on sand. She had every right to hate him. She had told him she would be angry. He had told her she would have the right. And now the right was exercised, and the anger was earned, and the space between them was filled with the rubble of a disguise that had served its purpose and destroyed its maker. Leo walked back to the barracks. He sat on his cot. He folded his uniform, the borrowed uniform, the one that smelled like corridor dust and cold tea, and placed it on the end of the bed. Tomorrow, he would wear different clothes. Tomorrow, he would be Prince Leo again, Crown Prince of Aldara, first in line to the throne. A man with power and title and the weight of a kingdom on his shoulders. Tonight, he was a guard named Emre, who had stood outside a door and been told to leave, and had left, because the woman on the other side of the door was the only authority he recognized. He did not sleep. He lay in the dark and thought about Clara's question, the one she had asked before everything collapsed. What did you feel? He had answered it with words, pretty words, accurate words, words that were true in the way that a portrait is true, capturing the surface without touching the depth. The real answer was simpler, and harder, and impossible to say out loud, because saying it would have sounded like one more performance from a man who had spent 7 weeks performing. He felt seen. For the first time in 25 years, someone had looked at him and seen the thing underneath the title. Not because she knew there was a title to look underneath, because she did not know, because the title was absent, and without it, the only thing visible was the person, and she had liked the person, and the person had been real. And now the person was dead, killed by the truth, replaced by a prince. And the prince had a kingdom to save. Philip arrived at the barracks at dawn. This time he was not in civilian clothes. He was in full military dress. The uniform of the General of the Royal Guard, decorated with 30 years of service medals, and the quiet, implacable authority of a man who had been waiting for this moment since the night Leo had walked out the service entrance with a bad haircut and a borrowed pack. "It is time," Philip said. Leo stood up, took off the guard's uniform for the last time, put on the clothes Philip had brought, royal garments, not the ceremonial ones with the gold thread and the embroidered crest, simple ones, a dark coat, clean trousers, polished boots, the clothes of a prince who was not performing royalty but resuming it. He looked in the small, cracked mirror on the barracks wall. The face that looked back was different from the one that had stood in the royal chambers 7 weeks ago. Thinner, harder, burned by hallway drafts and kitchen heat, and the kind of exposure that comes from living at the bottom of a system you were born to sit on top of. The bad haircut had grown out. It still looked wrong, but it looked wrong in a way that suited him now, the way a scar suits a man who earned it. "Ready?" Philip asked. Leo looked at the barracks room one last time. 5 cots, 5 men still sleeping. Simon's letter, folded and tucked under his pillow. Owen's boots, unlaced, by the door. Nate's snoring, which had become so familiar it was almost comforting. He would miss it. Not the discomfort, not the food, not the shifts, but the anonymity, the freedom of being no one, the strange, terrifying, beautiful experience of mattering to people who had no reason to pretend. "Ready," Leo said. They walked out of the barracks and into the dawn light. The palace rose above them, gilded by early sun, enormous and ancient and full of people who were about to learn that the guard from the eastern corridor was the prince they had been gossiping about for 7 weeks. The collision of his 2 lives was about to happen. And on the other side of it, Leo did not know what would be left standing. But he knew what he was fighting for. Not just the crown, not just the kingdom. A records hall, a filing system, a woman with a pen behind her ear, who had seen the kingdom more clearly than anyone who ruled it. He was fighting for the world she had shown him. Even if she never wanted to see him again. The council chamber was on the second floor of the western wing, behind doors that weighed more than some of the people who walked through them. Oak and iron. Built to impress. Built to remind anyone who entered that the room behind them held the collected authority of 14 noble houses and a monarchy that had survived 3 centuries through a combination of strategic marriages, controlled violence, and the careful management of information. Leo had not been in this room for 7 weeks. The last time he had stood here, he had been wearing royal clothes and arguing with his father about the succession. Now he was wearing royal clothes again, and the argument had changed, and the stakes had multiplied, and the man sitting in the chair at the head of the table was not his father. It was Victor. Not on the throne. The throne was at the far end of the chamber, empty, waiting, its velvet seat and carved back as ceremonial as the crown it represented. Victor was sitting in the chair reserved for the acting head of succession, a lesser seat, positioned at the council table rather than above it. But the positioning did not matter. What mattered was that he was sitting, and the council members were arranged around him, and the document on the table in front of them was the succession petition that Philip had warned about, and 11 of 14 noble family seals were already pressed into the wax at the bottom. Leo pushed through the doors. The room went silent. Not the silence of shock, the silence of recalculation. 14 council members, their advisors, their scribes, and Victor, all performing the same mental operation simultaneously, adjusting their understanding of the situation to accommodate the fact that the crown prince, who had been absent for 7 weeks, and whose absence had been positioned as abandonment, was standing in the doorway, in clean clothes, with a general at his back, and an expression on his face that did not belong to a man who had come to negotiate. Victor recovered first. He always recovered first. It was his greatest skill. "Brother," Victor said. The word was warm. The smile was genuine. The eyes behind the smile were running calculations faster than the rest of his face could mask. "We were beginning to worry." "I can see that," Leo said. He walked to the table. He did not sit. Standing was a choice. Standing meant he was not joining the discussion. He was interrupting it. "The succession petition," Leo said, looking at the document. 11 signatures. Impressive, especially given that 6 of those signatures were obtained through promises of tax exemptions that you do not have the authority to grant, and 3 were obtained through the leveraging of debt records that are sealed by royal judicial order. The room shifted. Not physically, energetically. The council members who had signed were suddenly aware that the man standing in front of them knew the terms of their agreement, and the terms were not the kind that survived public disclosure. Victor's smile did not waver. "Those are serious accusations, Leo. I hope you have documentation." "I do." Leo turned to Philip, who was standing by the door. Philip opened the door. Clara walked in. She was not wearing her records hall gray. She was wearing the formal dress of a palace official, the one reserved for archivists, called to provide testimony in judicial proceedings. It was not new. It was not tailored. It hung on her slightly wrong, borrowed from one of the senior archivists who had worn it once in 30 years, and had kept it in a cedar chest since. But Clara wore it the way she wore everything, with the posture of someone who did not need clothes to communicate authority. She was carrying 12 years of records. Not copies, originals. Bound, indexed, cross-referenced, and organized with the methodical precision that Leo had watched her develop over 7 weeks of late nights and lamplit work, and conversations through doorways about the architecture of governance. She did not look at Leo. She had not spoken to him since the night in the records hall. She was not here for him. She was here because Philip had come to the records hall at dawn and told her that the crown prince was reclaiming the succession and needed the documentation she had spent 3 years building. And Clara, who hated the monarchy on principle and loved the truth more than she loved any institution, had agreed. Not for Leo, for the records. She set the documents on the council table. The stack was thick enough to cast a shadow. "My name is Clara Whitmore," she said. Her voice was clear and steady, the voice of a woman who had spent her entire life being underestimated and had used every minute of it.
"I am the senior records clerk of the National Archives. I have been asked to present documentation relevant to the succession proceedings." Victor leaned forward.
His smile was still in place, but the warmth behind it had cooled by several degrees. A records clerk, presenting documentation to the Council of Houses. This is unusual. The documentation is unusual, Clara said. I will let it speak for itself. She opened the first volume. Land transfers. 30 years of property changing hands without proper judicial authorization. She laid out the pattern with the efficiency of someone who had rehearsed this in her head 1,000 times, without ever expecting to perform it. Each transfer linked to a noble family on the council. Each family linked to a financial benefit that corresponded with a vote they had cast on legislation that served their interests. The corruption was not hidden. It was filed, properly documented, properly cross-referenced, sitting in the archives like a confession that no one had bothered to read. The council members shifted in their chairs. Some of them recognized the transactions. Some of them recognized their own names. Clara moved to the second volume. Financial records. Treasury disbursements that did not match the services they were supposed to fund. The money that had disappeared from the public works budget and reappeared in the noble expense accounts. The 40% increase in household taxation that had funded a 20% decrease in public services. The numbers laid bare, documented, irrefutable. She moved to the third volume, and this was the one that mattered. Complaints. 3 formal complaints filed against Prince Victor by palace staff, each one documented, each one containing testimony, dates, details, and each one marked with the same notation in the judicial review log. Withdrawn, not resolved, not investigated. Withdrawn, which meant the complainants had been persuaded, through means the records did not specify but strongly implied, to remove their statements from the official record. But Clara had found the original filings, before the withdrawals. In a section of the archives that had been mislabeled, filed under provincial correspondence rather than judicial proceedings, either by accident or by design. She had found them 3 years ago. She had cross-referenced them with the withdrawal records. She had built a timeline, and the timeline showed a pattern that was as clear as it was damning. Victor's smile was gone now, replaced by something that looked like his face had been assembled from the same materials but in a different order. The same features, rearranged to accommodate a reality that he had not planned for. These documents are unverified, Victor said. His voice was controlled, but controlled the way a leashed dog is controlled. The aggression was there. The leash was straining. They are original palace records, Clara said, filed in the National Archives under the cataloging system established by Royal Charter. Their authenticity is verifiable by any judicial officer with access to the archive's reference index, which I built, and which I can open to any investigator the council appoints. She said this looking at the council, not at Victor. She was not addressing the accused, she was addressing the judges, and the judges were looking at the documents on the table with the expressions of men who had been comfortable in a system that protected them, and were now watching that system turned inside out by a woman they had never heard of. Leo stepped forward. Not to speak for Clara. She had spoken for herself more effectively than he could have imagined. He stepped forward, because what came next was his responsibility, not hers. I move for the immediate dismissal of the succession petition, Leo said, on the grounds that the signatories include council members whose positions are compromised by documented corruption, and that the petitioning prince is the subject of unresolved complaints that have been improperly suppressed. Victor stood up. The chair scraped against the stone floor. The sound was harsh in the quiet room. You disappeared for 7 weeks, Victor said. You abandoned your duties. You left the succession unattended. And now you walk in here with a filing clerk and a stack of old papers and expect the council to simply forget that you were not here when the kingdom needed you? I was here, Leo said. I was standing in the eastern corridor, night shift, watching the part of this palace that none of you have ever visited. And what I saw, what I learned, what I found, is on that table. The question is not where I have been. The question is where the money has been, where the complaints went, where the accountability disappeared to. The room was quiet, the kind of quiet that precedes a decision. The head of the council, Lord Avery, a man who had held his seat for 20 years and had survived every political shift during that time through the strategic application of neutrality, looked at the documents on the table, and then at Leo, and then at Victor, and then back at the documents. The council will review the documentation, Avery said. All sessions will be suspended pending the review. The succession petition is tabled until further notice. Victor's face was very still. The stillness of a man who is doing math, who is calculating distances and options and exit strategies, and finding that the numbers do not work in any direction. This is a mistake, Victor said. Then the review will prove it, Avery said. If the documents are invalid, the petition resumes. If they are valid, the petition is void. Either way, the process is served. Victor looked at Leo. For the first time since Leo had entered the room, the brothers made eye contact, without performance, without strategy, without the social choreography that had governed their relationship since childhood. Just two men looking at each other across a table covered in the evidence of what one of them had done and the other had uncovered. Victor did not speak. He turned. He walked out of the council chamber. His footsteps echoed on the stone. The door closed behind him with the weight of oak and iron. The council began its review. Clara stood at the table for 3 more hours, answering questions, providing references, opening specific volumes to specific pages when council members requested verification of specific claims. She was methodical. She was precise. She was devastatingly thorough. Every question met with a citation. Every challenge met with a page number. The index she had built, the one no one had asked for, the one the head archivist had smiled at, became the map that the council followed through 12 years of documented corruption. By the end of the session, 9 of the 11 signatories had requested that their seals be removed from the petition, not out of principle, out of self-preservation. The documents Clara had presented contained enough information to launch investigations into their own finances, and the fastest way to avoid investigation was to distance themselves from the petition that had brought the documentation to light. Victor was stripped of his succession rights by a vote of 9-5 before the sun set. The remaining 5 held out not because they believed in Victor, but because surrendering meant admitting that the system they had built was visible, that a woman in a records hall had seen through it, that the architecture of privilege and silence they had spent decades constructing could be dismantled by a clerk with a pen and a filing system. It was not enough. The vote carried. The petition was voided. The succession was secured. Leo stood in the council chamber after the members had filed out, and the scribes had packed their records, and the room had emptied of everything except the long table and the documents, and the 2 people who had brought them. Clara was organizing the volumes, stacking them neatly, checking for damage, treating them with the same care she treated everything in the archives, because the records were her responsibility, and she would not leave them on a council table to be mishandled by people who did not understand their value. Clara, Leo said. She did not look up. She continued stacking. Her movements were precise, controlled. The same composure she had maintained through the entire session. The same mask she had worn since the night he told her the truth. "Thank you," he said. "I did not do this for you," she said. She picked up the final volume and placed it on the stack. "I did this for the records. The records deserve to be read. They deserve to be acted on. That is what they are for. I know. You do not get to thank me as if I did you a favor. This is my work. It has been my work for 3 years. The fact that it was useful to your political situation is incidental." Leo nodded. She was right. Again. The work was hers. The index was hers. The discovery was hers. He had provided the stage, but she had built the performance. From 3 years of late nights and cross-references, and the stubborn, solitary belief that the truth would matter if anyone ever bothered to look for it. "What happens now?" Clara asked. She was holding the stack of volumes against her chest, the way she held things that were important to her, close and protected, and slightly away from anyone who might try to take them. "The council will investigate. Victor will face consequences. The succession is mine. And the systems? The corruption in the land transfers? The missing public funds? The complaints that were suppressed? Will those be addressed? Or will the investigation stop at Victor and leave the architecture intact?" The question was the most important thing anyone had said in the council chamber all day, because it cut through the political theater and pointed at the structural problem underneath it. Victor was not the disease. Victor was a symptom. The disease was the system that had allowed him to operate, the sealed records, the appointed judges, the circular accountability that let power investigate itself and find nothing wrong. "I will address them," Leo said. Clara looked at him. For the first time since the night in the records hall, she held his gaze for more than a second. Her eyes were not warm. They were not cold. They were assessing, measuring, running the same calculation she ran on every piece of information that crossed her desk, the calculation that determined whether something was true or merely convenient. "We will see," she said. She walked out of the council chamber with 12 years of records held against her chest, and her back straight, and her footsteps steady on the stone floor. Leo watched her go. He did not follow. He stood in the empty chamber and looked at the throne at the far end of the room. The seat his father had occupied for 30 years. The seat his grandfather had occupied before that. The seat that represented everything he had been born to, and everything he had spent 7 weeks running from, and everything he was about to inherit. It was just a chair. An expensive, uncomfortable, historically significant chair. And the woman who had just walked out of the room had shown him that the chair mattered less than the systems it was supposed to serve. He sat down at the council table. Not the throne, the table, where the work was done. And he began to plan. The coronation happened on the first day of autumn. King Harold gave his blessing from his bed. He could no longer stand for more than a few minutes. The illness had taken his legs first, then his stamina, then the sharp edges of his mind, rounding them into soft curves that made his words drift, and his eyes wander to places in the room that no one else could see. But on the morning of the coronation, he was clear. Clear enough to hold Leo's hand and look at him with eyes that were wet and say, "You look different." "I am different," Leo said. Harold studied his son's face. The harder angles, the lines that had not been there 2 months ago. The posture that was not the trained posture of a prince, but the earned posture of a man who had stood 12-hour shifts and carried supply crates and sanded boards until his hands bled. "Did you find what you were looking for?" Harold asked. "I found someone," Leo said. "Whether she will have me is a question that belongs to her." Harold nodded. The nod was slow, considered, the gesture of a man who had spent 30 years in a marriage that had taught him everything about duty and nothing about love, and who recognized, at the end of his life, that the lesson his son had learned in 7 weeks was the one he had missed entirely. "Your mother would have liked that answer," Harold said. Leo squeezed his father's hand. Harold's grip was weak. The grip of a man whose body was leaving before his mind was ready. The ceremony was held in the Great Hall. 300 people, council members, noble families, military officers, diplomatic representatives, palace staff. Leo walked the length of the hall in the coronation robes, heavy garments embroidered with the Aldara crest, and felt the weight of them differently than he had expected. Not as a burden, as a responsibility. A tangible, physical representation of the thing Clara had described in her midnight conversations. The structure, the system, the architecture that outlasted any individual king and served, or failed to serve, the people it was built to govern. The crown was placed on his head by Lord Avery, because Harold was too ill to attend and the head of the council served as proxy in such circumstances. The crown was heavy, gold and sapphire, and the accumulated symbolism of 300 years. It pressed against Leo's temples like a headache that had decided to become permanent. He sat on the throne, the council knelt, the hall knelt. 300 people bent their knees and lowered their heads and acknowledged, through the ritual that had been performed identically for 3 centuries, that the man on the chair was their king. Leo looked out over the hall, the faces blurred, not from tears, from the scale of it. 300 people, each one representing a web of relationships and obligations and expectations that would now intersect with his decisions for the rest of his life. He searched the hall for one face. She was not there. He had not expected her to be. He had not invited her. He had not sent a message or a summons or an intermediary. In the 3 weeks since the council session, he had done nothing to contact her. Not because he did not want to, because he wanted it so much that doing it would have been an act of power, the king summoning the clerk, the prince calling the commoner, the man with the crown reaching for the woman without one. He would not do that. He would not use the throne to solve a personal problem. He would not let the weight of his title press against her the way Victor had pressed. If she came to him, it would be because she chose to, and if she never came, he would live with that, because living with it was the only response that honored what she had taught him. The first 3 months of his reign were consumed by the work Clara's documents had set in motion. The council investigations expanded from Victor's immediate actions to the broader patterns of corruption she had uncovered. Land transfers were reviewed. Tax records were audited. The missing public funds were traced, not to a single account or a single person, but to a network of noble families who had been siphoning resources through legal mechanisms that were technically permitted because the laws had been written by the people benefiting from them. Leo dismantled the mechanisms, not through decree, through legislation. Working with the council members who had survived the investigation with their reputations intact, he rewrote the tax code, restructured the judicial appointment process, and established an independent auditing body with the authority to investigate any financial transaction involving public funds. It was slow work, grinding work, the kind of work that did not make songs or inspire paintings, but it was the work that mattered, and Leo did it with the focused determination of a man who had stood in a hallway for 7 weeks and learned that the people who keep the system running are the ones who see it most clearly. He thought about Clara constantly, not in the romantic, consuming way that stories describe, in the structural way, the way you think about a foundation when you are building a house. She was in every decision, every reform, every argument with a council member who wanted to preserve a privilege that the records showed was built on diverted public funds. Her voice was in his head, not as a ghost, but as a consultant. What would Clara say about this? What would the records show? What would the truth look like if someone bothered to find it? He did not contact her. He built. The National Archives Charter was drafted in his 2nd month. Leo spent 3 weeks on it, working with the legal scholars Philip recommended, creating a document that would establish the archives as an independent institution, fully funded, with its own budget line in the National Treasury. The director would be appointed by merit examination, not by royal decree. The appointment panel would be composed of academics, jurists, and archivists, none of whom would be appointed by the Crown. He signed the charter on a Tuesday afternoon. The document was delivered to the records hall by a palace courier, who had no idea why the king was sending a legal charter to a room full of old paper. Clara read it. Leo heard about her reaction from Philip, who heard it from the courier, who had waited while she read it, standing in the doorway of the records hall the way Leo used to stand, watching the same expression of focused attention cross the same face. She had read it twice. Asked the courier 3 questions about the funding structure, then said, "Tell the king, the merit examination clause has a loophole in paragraph 7 that allows the appointment panel to be reconstituted by royal order. Fix it, and the charter is sound." Leo fixed paragraph 7. The revised charter was delivered the next day. Clara read it, made no further comments. The charter was published. The National Archives became an independent institution. Its first open director position was announced the following week. Clara applied, along with 14 other candidates. The examination was administered by the panel Leo had specified, composed of people he had never met and could not influence. The examination was rigorous, 3 rounds, written analysis, oral presentation, and a practical assessment of archival methodology. Clara scored highest in all 3 rounds. The margin was not close. She was appointed director of the National Archives on the first day of winter, 3 months after the coronation, and 5 months after a guard named Emre Cole had stood outside her door and watched her walk past him as if he were part of the wall. Leo learned of the appointment through official channels, a report from the panel, delivered to his desk along with 90 other reports, about 90 other matters that required his attention. He read it, set it down, picked it up, read it again. He did not send congratulations. He did not send flowers. He did not summon her, or visit her, or do any of the things that a man in his position could do, and that a man in his position should not do. Because the appointment was hers. The position was hers. The achievement was hers. And the worst thing he could do, the thing that would reduce it, would be to claim any proximity to it. He waited. 3 months passed. Winter deepened. The palace was cold in a way Leo had never noticed before his time in the barracks, where the cold had been a companion rather than an inconvenience. He held council meetings, and signed legislation, and received diplomatic envoys, and ate meals alone in the royal dining room, which was large enough for 40 people, and felt emptier with each passing day. Philip asked, once, whether Leo intended to pursue the matter of a queen. Leo said, The matter of a queen is not mine to pursue. Philip, who had served 3 decades in a military that valued directness, said, "That is either the wisest or the most stubborn thing you have ever said, and I cannot tell which." "Both," Leo said. On the first day of spring, a formal request arrived on Leo's desk. It was from the director of the National Archives, requesting an audience with the king regarding archival funding for regional expansion. The request was proper, official, filed through the correct channels, with the correct forms, bearing the correct seals, a bureaucratic document requesting a bureaucratic meeting about a bureaucratic matter. Leo's hands were trembling when he approved it. He did not schedule the meeting in his private study. He scheduled it in the throne room, the most public, most visible, most official space in the palace. Because if Clara was going to see him again, it would be on terms that left no room for ambiguity, no closed doors, no private conversations, no space where power could operate invisibly. The throne room was a stage, and if he was going to be looked at by the woman who had last looked at him with hurt in her eyes, he wanted to be seen in the place where hiding was impossible. She arrived on time. She was always on time. She was wearing the formal dress of a palace official, her own this time, not borrowed. It fit. Her hair was pinned up in the way he remembered, the hasty, practical arrangement that suggested mirrors were a waste of time, and there were records to organize. She carried a leather folio. Inside it, Leo knew, was the regional expansion proposal, a plan to establish branch archives in every province, staffed by trained archivists, accessible to any citizen who wanted to read the records that shaped their lives. The plan was ambitious. The plan was expensive. The plan was exactly what she had described in a midnight conversation about transparent governance, delivered now not as a theory, but as a budget proposal. She stood before the throne and presented it. Her voice was clear, professional, and contained no trace of the woman who had once left tea on a stone ledge for a guard she was trying not to care about. She was the director of the National Archives, addressing the King of Aldara on a matter of institutional policy, and she conducted herself with the authority of someone who had earned her position through examination and merit and 3 years of work that no one had asked for. Leo listened. He asked questions. The questions were about the budget, the staffing plan, the timeline for implementation. They were the questions a king should ask, not the questions a man in love should ask. The proposal was sound. He approved it. Clara closed her folio, bowed, the formal bow of a palace official, concluding a royal audience, turned to leave. "Clara." She stopped. 1 foot forward, 1 foot planted, her body caught between departure and the sound of a name she had not heard him use since the night in the records hall. The throne room was not empty. There were attendants, guards, a scribe recording the audience for the official record, people who would hear whatever he said next and file it in their memories, the way Clara filed things in her archives, permanently, with full context. "I am not auditioning you," Leo said. "I am not evaluating you. I am not testing you or measuring you, or deciding whether you are suitable for anything. I am asking. One dinner, not as your king." The throne room was very quiet. The guards looked at the floor, the scribe's pen stopped moving, the attendants developed a sudden and intense interest in the architecture of the ceiling. Clara stood in the middle of the room. She did not turn around. She was facing the doors, the massive oak and iron doors that opened onto the corridor, that led to the eastern wing, that led to the records hall, that led to a door with a hinge that had once been rusted, where a guard had once stood night after night and waited for a woman to decide he was worth acknowledging. The silence stretched. It stretched past discomfort and past awkwardness and into something else, something that felt like the space between 2 tectonic plates, where enormous forces are at work, and the outcome depends on pressures that are invisible and ancient and cannot be rushed. Clara turned around. Her face was not composed, not the mask, not the wall, not the engineering she had built to protect herself from men in uniforms who said things they did not mean. Her face was open, raw, the face of a woman who had been hurt and had healed and was standing in a throne room, looking at a man who had lied to her and then changed a kingdom because of what she had taught him, and she was deciding whether the man who had done both of those things was the same person or 2 different people, and whether the answer mattered. "One," she said. The word was small. The word was enormous. Leo did not smile. He held her gaze, and felt the weight of the crown on his head, and the weight of everything they had been, and everything they had lost, and everything they might become. And he understood that one was not a promise. It was a door, and the door was open, and the opening was narrow, and it had been built by a woman who did not open doors for men who had not earned it. He had not earned it. Not yet. Earning it would take time. Time measured not in weeks or months but in the slow, accumulating evidence of actions that matched words. Tax reforms that reached the people they were designed to serve. Archives that opened their doors to citizens who had never been inside a government building. A monarchy that served its structure rather than its bloodline. He would earn it the way she had taught him. Through the work. Through the records. Through the stubborn, solitary, unglamorous process of doing the thing that mattered, and trusting that someone, somewhere, was paying attention. Clara left the throne room. Her footsteps echoed on the stone. The doors closed behind her with the weight of oak and iron. And Leo sat on the throne and felt the crown pressing against his temples, and thought about what he would wear to a dinner that was not royal, and not formal, and not a performance. Something simple. Something an Emre Cole might have worn, if Emre Cole had been real. Something honest. The dinner happened on a Saturday. Not in the palace. In a small tavern in the lower quarter of the city. The kind of place where the food was good because it had to be. Where the tables were close together because space was expensive. And where a king in plain clothes could sit across from a woman who distrusted crowns and eat a meal that was not designed to impress anyone. They talked. Not about the kingdom. Not about the archives. Not about Victor, or the succession, or the 7 weeks that had changed both of their lives. They talked about the things people talk about when they are starting from the beginning. Books. Food. The particular absurdity of palace architecture. The fact that Leo had once sanded boards until his hands bled, because a woman he barely knew had said his first attempt was too rough. Clara laughed at that. A real laugh. The laugh she had been too guarded to give him in the records hall, and too hurt to give him in the council chamber, and too proud to give him in the throne room. A laugh that came from a place behind the walls, and the masks and the defenses, from the part of her that was just a person, sitting across from another person, eating bread and drinking wine, and deciding whether the thing between them was worth the risk of another wound. Leo watched her laugh, and felt something settle in his chest. Not the thunderbolt of the poets, not the grand recognition of destiny. Something quieter, something that felt like the end of a very long shift. The moment when the weight leaves your legs, and the corridor goes dark, and you can finally stop standing. He did not ask for a second dinner. He did not need to. Clara asked him. 3 days later, a note, delivered to his desk through official channels, written in the same small, precise handwriting that had once been tucked beneath a cup of tea on a stone ledge. Same place. Thursday, your turn to pay. Leo read it, folded it, put it in the drawer where he kept the things that mattered. The drawer contained his mother's ring and a guard service record from the Eastern Corridor, and now this. 3 items, 3 versions of himself. A son, a guard, a man sitting across from a woman in a tavern who did not need his title and did not want his palace, and was building something with him that was not a monarchy, and not a romance, and not a fairy tale. Something better. Something that did not need a crown to survive. They both knew it. Which is exactly why it would.